most of the time, people are more willing to help you than to take your idea. And to be honest, if you're a startup founder who cares enough about what you're building, like they took the idea and succeeded, it'd be frustrating, but you'd also be really happy, because really what your focus should be like solving the problem. And if someone else solves the problem, then great, right? Like that's a good thing. Speak to as many people as possible about what you're doing in a completely open and honest conversation, and get that feedback, and be willing to understand the negatives. Fundamentally, like everyone can tell you how good you are, but actually it's the people who will challenge you who are the most valuable.
I have always had a very mixed relationship with activism. I used to be something of an activist when I was younger. At some point I realized that, you know, it's about talking, talking a good game is one thing, but what am I actually doing about it? And when you realize that you're protesting against an organization that really doesn't give a shit about what you have to say and how long you stand out in the rain and do anything, then what you're doing is entirely, it comes to a point where it feels like you're virtue signaling. When you, if you are or you're not, it feels like a bit of a waste of time. And you know, ultimately what I say to people who are interested in acting in the rain, if you've got a skill set, then what you contribute towards achieving that goal, that to me is a better use of your time and resources than it is to go and stand outside in the pissing rain or getting arrested and, you know, getting a criminal record.
As individuals, like use your voice, like use your wallet. You know, you don't have to change your life radically. You can just support businesses which are doing better. You can support organizations which are pushing for change without even
getting arrested and, you know,
in your life. So I think that there's some real power just generally in our lifestyles that we have, which we generally don't talk about. And we could all use that for positive change. I think that there's some real power generally in our
right, I've just started recording.
Great.
I hope that's okay. So how are you?
Yeah, good. It's been a hectic few weeks with Techstars and everything. I think that there's some real power, but doing well, really, really positive. So.
Oh, great. How was Techstars?
Still on it, but we're we had there's 2 weeks that they have sort of in the second month of the program where from 1 till 5 every day for 2 weeks. I think that there's some real power. 15-minute calls with mentors/investors with feedback and intros. It's very, very intense and very, very full on, but also incredible. Like you meet the most incredible people, and then you have to choose 3 of these, 3 to 5 of these people to be your lead mentor for the rest of the program. And it's like choosing 3 to 5 out of 100 is incredibly difficult. But we finished that, and now we're just moving on with the rest of the program, which is still intense, but not quite as full
on. It's crazy because I remember we spoke initially quite a while ago now, a couple of months back, wasn't it? And man, so much seems to have happened, and obviously, you know, following you online and stuff, it's crazy. It's been a bit of a whirlwind, hasn't it, with the things going on your end? I mean, you've launched since we spoke, right? I mean, just tell me what's been going on. I know that, but what else? There's been so much stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so we had a beta period for Canopy for 3 months, whereby we weren't really talking about it being live. It was just really to get feedback from users that we built into our community already, and then execute on that feedback super quickly. So that was really positive. And despite not marketing through that period, we still saw growth month on month, and was really great feedback. And to be honest, despite there being obvious startup growing pains with various bugs being found and all the rest, I was surprised at how well it went. And then once we'd sort of executed on a number of that feedback and made some changes and sort of iterated on that, then it was time for more of a public launch. But again, we didn't want to just public launch and turn on all the marketing taps instantly. So we had some PR coverage, which was fantastic. And actually, just because of that, we saw nearly a 200% increase in growth just from 10 days of October from the whole period of before. So really, really positive. And now we're at that period where it's okay, cool. Things seem to be stable with this increase. The site is live. We're getting random people coming there, giving us feedback. Now's the time to open the marketing taps and turn everything on. So it's been quite intense period of like execution and then sort of implementing this strategy that we've had sort of built for quite a long time now, and making sure all of those are in line to really drive growth. So a lot's been going on around that, but that's really been the focus for everyone at the company right now.
That's really interesting. I definitely want to ask a few questions about that in a moment, but I suppose before we get into it, good thing to do, that this is kind of the only bit of structure that I always say on this show, is to ask for you to introduce yourself and a bit about the business, and give everyone listening and watching kind of a bit of a sense, because obviously I always do that. I always just dive straight in. I've got so many questions, but yeah, if you wouldn't mind, the mic is yours for a little bit. And while you're doing that, I'll probably share some stuff on the screen, so don't be surprised if I do that.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So I'm Thomas. I'm the founder and CEO of Canopy.com. I've spent my entire career directly onboarding tens of thousands of people into the climate movement with the world's largest environmental organizations, but also having been a second-time founder in the consumer industry as well. So founded the first company in the UK to commercialize the extending consumer product life at the end of events and festivals. When the pandemic came, obviously that entire industry was decimated. And that was the point where Canopy sort of triggered into existence, whereby we'd spoken to, thousands and thousands of people over our careers, and had spoken to thousands of businesses that were trying to build these better products, but there was this huge disconnect across that industry. So Canopy was set up as the home for buying better. The ethical consumer market's super fragmented. If you want to verify claims, learn about swaps, track your impact, or buy a product, they're all done on separate platforms, separate user journeys. It's really complicated. Over half the population find it so complicated they don't even bother trying. Canopy is the first and only platform which completely streamlines that ethical consumer journey. So we verify green claims with certifications and audits. We have EdTech built into the platform for learning, shopping for convenience, but also impact data on purchases, so you can see the carbon emissions, water waste, and plastic waste that you're saving when you make a purchase compared to the mainstream alternative. And that's how we then gamify the platform and keep people coming back. But the most important thing is that is all on one platform with one user journey. So tying convenience into sustainability. Alongside being a founder and sort of ex-environmental organization employee, I'm also a climate tech advisor on 2 accelerators, one at Imperial College, Virgin Startup, and one at University of East Anglia.
What's interesting to me is the journey, right? Like, so take me back to sort of the beginning when you had this idea. Well, actually, yeah, even what sparked the idea? What was that moment? So talk me through that. So obviously, I know you've been involved, like you mentioned, in a huge amount of efforts for in regards to climate change and sustainability and so on. So I'm assuming that it might have been something bubbling up for a while, or was there a bit of a light bulb moment? And then from then on, what was the journey to get to where you are? You talked about a lot of amazing achievements along the way, working with some, co-founders that are really quite remarkable and all that. So yeah, just talk me through a bit of that journey, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really great to talk about that story a bit, because that sort of like defines everything that we're doing and everything we've built. So there's a bit of context and for sort of like the trigger point of working in climate, which was that as a teenager, I was actually an international swimmer, really randomly. And that had been my entire life purpose, was to go to the Olympics and to win a gold medal and all of these things and be sponsored, and that would be my life. So when I had to quit that due to injury, I felt a massive loss of purpose. I'd spent my entire teenage years being incredibly ambitious, driven, basically living like a founder life, but as a sports person, long hours, a lot of stress. So it was very difficult for me to know really what was going to come next. And actually, there's a point in that when things sort of started to change, and that was, I basically took a year out from school through to university between there to work, and I worked as a tailor in Levi's, and it was a super sort of baptism of fire into sort of like the fast fashion industry, because Levi's have all of these great policies that they're working on, but still their products are still very, very fast fashion-esque in the way that they're made still. And when I was doing that, I sort of became more and more impassioned about how this was happening and what we needed to do to improve that industry, and even just as a mere tailor in like a basement shop. It really sort of started to make me care more about what was going on across that industry. And I would say that at that point, that was sort of like the flicker, not so much like a light bulb moment, but definitely a flicker of sort of interest that had been triggered in me, I think. But then when I went to, so I went to university, all my friends had gone. I was sort of like the only one left in the city. I didn't want to just stay where I'd grown up and like never leave. So I chose to go to university and study politics, international relations, and met someone who was working at Greenpeace at university. And that was just a huge enlightenment for me, like speaking to this person who was working in an organization which had been running for 50 years, had changed the world quite literally in the things that they'd managed to get through policy and through business. And it was the same feeling, the same purpose-driven sort of attitude that I felt within me that I'd had when I was a swimmer. So I actually think that it's all the way back then, before I'd even started working for Greenpeace, that actually I kind of knew that I was going to be on this journey for sort of the rest of my career, wherever that took me. And that was going to be my purpose. And that's a much easier purpose to sort of like have, in the sense that it doesn't really go away. Nothing's going to stop me needing to work on the climate. Unless we just, miraculously solve all the problems overnight, I'm still going to need to work. So it was really, really important for me at that point to really start becoming learned in that area, but also working where I could to improve what I could. So then I got involved with Greenpeace. I basically spoke with this person, are there any jobs open, got involved and went and worked as a foot soldier fundraiser, the hardest job because you need to know about all the campaigns, but you also need to take all of the shit that comes at you when people don't like what you're saying. And you need to be able to come back at that with calm and informed response, and basically fundraising, first experience.
Yeah, and it's basically sales, isn't it? Like some of the best salespeople I've worked with have done that as a previous sort of job. It's not very forgiving, let's just say. It's pretty thankless.
It's incredibly difficult. You have targets of how many people you speak to, and most of those people are going to tell you they don't care or they're not interested. And actually what we found through my time working there, through speaking with literally probably tens of thousands of people, and actually I did the math on the number of people I managed to get to sign up to support Greenpeace and to sort of begin changing their lifestyle, and it was just over 20,000 people, so within sort of 4 years, and it was really, really and it's quite hard because they're not getting anything out of that other than supporting an organization whose work. They're not buying something, so giving money basically is charity, right? But also the biggest thing that came up through that was that there were three main things that people were struggling with when adopting sustainable lifestyle, and that was that they didn't have enough time, they didn't have enough knowledge, and they couldn't afford it. And these two things came up again and again and again in every aspect of any work that I did with Greenpeace or outside of Greenpeace related to the climate, was that people really wanted to. They wanted to be able to say that they had a sustainable lifestyle, but they just couldn't come across those three barriers. And because it wasn't as convenient as doing the non-sustainable thing, that generally was where they fell back into, which I totally understand, right? At the time, I probably was less understanding, but now I totally get it. And I think that through that journey with Greenpeace, I became very aware of lots of different issues within the climate, but also within the climate movement itself, and the way that we relay information, the way that we talk about things, the way that what we expect from individuals. I have sort of formed quite strong opinions on why the climate movement had failed to solve the climate crisis, because I'd seen it from the inside and what we'd struggled to do and how we'd struggled to get people we needed to get on board with it. And actually, I left Greenpeace not because of Greenpeace, but because of the work, the timelines that it took to convert huge businesses, the biggest businesses in the world and the largest governments in the world. How long it took them to implement change was so frustrating to me, as someone who had come from a fast-paced sports career into sort of wanting to make change and really bring on people on board. And I'd moved my way up through the ranks of Greenpeace into events and outreach, and suddenly I was just really frustrated that we would talk to all these people, but I feel like I'd have to wait years sometimes to be able to tell them that we'd won something. And I found that quite difficult. So when I left Greenpeace, I, as I said, was in their events team. I had been working in festivals for quite a while around Greenpeace as well. So I played music in a band. I had toured the UK with that band whilst working for Greenpeace, and was very aware of the issues of consumer waste at festivals and events. So, you know, huge, just like waves of like plastic consumer waste, tents, chairs, bottles, like just like incinerated at the end. In fact, in the UK alone, 250,000 tents alone go into the incinerator every single year. And charities and scavengers are managed to collect about 1 to 2% of leftover waste, but the rest they don't have the resource to collect. And that's just a huge problem for that industry. So the first thing that I set up out of Greenpeace was my first company, and I just decided that I'd just give it a shot. And I set up my first company, Festovers. We built a model whereby we weren't doing it on our free time. We were paid by festivals and events to come in before the cleaning companies to collect as much of that consumer waste as feasibly possible in the time we were given, to make sure that none of it ended up in landfill. And the festivals that we worked and piloted with in our first year, we collected over 90% compared to the previous 1 to 2%. And then that waste, instead of it then just being taken and discarded, obviously would be cleaned, repurposed, sold on. So all into a sort of circular model of that not ending up in landfill. And it was really successful. You know, we found out that pilot year had gone well. Obviously, we'd spent a lot of money to test a lot of things. And then we knew that the model that we had sort of settled on would be profitable as soon as we went into year 2. And then a global pandemic came and decimated the industry, decimated my company. Festivals weren't going to sign contracts. People weren't going to invest into the industry. I didn't really know anything. You know, I was a first-time founder. I'd been a year into that journey, so I was pretty new to all of it as well anyway. So I didn't really know how to navigate a lot of that, and learned just like, you know, again, baptism of fire, just like learning all of these challenges and what to do. And ultimately, that led to the closing of my first company, but the starting of Canopy. And Canopy came from essentially through that entire journey, having come from sport, going into tailoring, speaking to tens of thousands of people about the barriers for them to accept climate within Greenpeace and just outside of that, you know, being at festivals, speaking with businesses, speaking to consumers, speaking to just individual people, and really deeply understanding the barriers for people to move from being a normal consumer to an ethical consumer, and what we needed to do that. And it came back to those 3 things again: time, knowledge, money. But it also just essentially the top level thing was that if it's not convenient, they're not going to do it. So Canopy was really set up out of the feeling of people, of understanding the problem and really looking to just that problem and being absolutely focused on that problem. And the solution can be whatever really, but Canopy is what we settled through our years of experience with that. Yeah, so that was sort of the journey to get to Canopy, at least. And obviously so much has happened since then.
And look, random question that isn't the most important question right now, that I'm sure is on everyone's mind, but I'm curious, what do you play in the band?
Guitar and singing. And actually, I've got 2 co-founders in Canopy, and one of those co-founders, Hugo, it was his band that I went. So we met at university, second year of uni. His band was playing in like the bar at my campus. And I went up to him afterwards and I was like, sounds like a love story, right? But I went up to him afterwards and I was like,
it sounds very romantic. Yeah.
I was like, you're beautiful. No, I was like, your band is great, but you need another guitarist. And he was like, we do. We've really been looking for another guitarist. Do you know one? And I was like, I'm a guitarist. And I'd joined his band and did lots of gigs around the UK. I also had another band actually with my sister. It was just me and my sister. And we played more like electronic music together. But with both of those, we just toured. And actually, it was the reason I chose Hugo as my sort of like the first person I went to found Canopy with, was as much as he's an extremely talented marketer and understands behavior change down probably better than anyone I know, he also was someone that I knew all the buttons to press if I want to wind him up, and he knows all the buttons to press if he wants to wind me up, and we also know when to back off. And actually, that was the only thing that really mattered for a co-founder for me, was that we knew how to navigate each other's emotional well-being, because otherwise it was going to not work, right? So I went to him because like I needed a marketer, I needed a brand guy, I needed all the stuff, but actually fundamentally I needed someone who just like gets me and I get them, and then we can just work through the shit together. And then
hugely important. Yeah. And I'm assuming in your previous business, you were doing that solo, so you didn't have a co-founder at the time, right?
Yeah, so it was just me, but obviously Hugo was a friend and we were still in the band together, and so I think that he came to like one of the festivals we worked and was around there if I needed advice on anything around sort of marketing or brand. But I was doing everything, like implementing everything. And then, but it was great that we got that experience of working together as well when he came to that festival, because as much as we had done all this social stuff together, even though being in a band does sometimes feel like a job, actually doing a job and actually working and having that relationship of like, founder and someone helping and all of this stuff was really valuable, because then we totally got it when we started the company together, to be like, okay,
like a trial period almost.
Yeah, exactly.
And like you said, even being in a band with each other, I mean, that is work. I mean, you've got to coordinate a lot of stuff. There's a hierarchy. You have to be organized, or sometimes be organized and everything else, right? So it's all like a test of the relationship, because a lot of friendships don't last, even in bands. Like I know, I've been in the industry,
Oh, right, cool. What do you play, by the way, or do?
So I used to play lead guitar.
Cool.
That was my thing many years ago in a different life, and then you won't believe this, but I long story short, because this isn't about me, and I've said this a few times on the podcast, but long story short, the first business I founded was a event promotion company, I guess you could say. It started as an open mic night that got extraordinarily popular, because we were sick with all the open mic nights just being crusty old men sitting in tiny little rooms with like 5 people playing, and they'd only allow their mates to play, and it was all really shit. And my mate and I really wanted to play, and my mates and I really wanted to play, but we all played different things, and I actually wanted to beatbox with my friend who was an MC, and of course they were like, no, we don't allow any of that sort of stuff in here. So we were like, all right, screw you guys, we'll do our own. So we did, and I ended up hosting it with my friend. So it was hosted by a beatboxer and an MC, and we would just say anyone could come up, doesn't matter what you do, and we would try and get as many people up as possible. So we democratized it, and we ended up packing out this one pub garden. We had people sitting on the roof of the pub to watch every week. There wasn't enough room, and this was a huge pub garden. We would have like 300 people watching, because it was new, it was different, like they didn't know what they were going to get, and then we would obviously host and get the crowd going and stuff.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I love so I've got a lot of, and I got the tattoo of the logo of the company on my arm. First ever company I put together, or business, I suppose, not company, business.
I've got my sister and my band like on me as well here. It's Life by Matty. My middle name is Life, Leif, and her middle name is Matilda. So we sort of merged them together. But yeah, no, super cool, man. That's a really interesting backstory. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very cool. And then from there we ended up doing gig nights and band nights, DJ night, and then it just sort of grew from there for a little bit, and then it just sort of fizzled out as everyone gets older and different things take over. But it's definitely a test of friendships, that's for sure.
I mean, touring in like a small van with like 3 other men sounds very, don't know where this is going, but yeah, it was
it's like the beginning of a movie that wouldn't be.
I know, right? Yeah. But it was the pressure, you very quickly like learn to learn to know that person, otherwise it's just not going to work, and you have to
I mean, you're living in each other's pockets essentially, aren't you? Because I don't know if you were doing this, but I know a lot of bands who tour, they're sleeping in the van, eating in the van, you're doing everything, like trying to cut costs, and you're not going to be spending money on accommodation and stuff. And
well, actually I lived in a van for a little while because I couldn't afford rent, and I went on a trip with Hugo, and instead of letting him sleep in the van, I made him sleep in a tent. So I always.
So you had already established the CEO, plus founder relationship. way ahead.
And I remember like one night, like him being in the tent, it was like night, and I was like, "Yep, see ya," and just like shut the door. And it felt absolutely brutal, but
yeah.
But anyway, it's completely off topic. But yeah, it was a good time. Good times.
Good
For me.
Yeah, for you. Not so. I'm sure he looked at those memories very differently. But yeah, hypothermia and everything else. You know,
well, he's alive,
being ravaged by wild animals.
He's good.
Yeah.
He agreed to start a company with me, so it must have gone quite well.
Well, yeah, he's probably scared of what you might do if he said no. That's why. Poor guy. I'm gonna have to speak to him, see if he's okay.
Get him on and then compare the podcasts.
Yeah. He'll just be mouthing help. Yeah.
Hope not.
But so yeah, I mean, the working with the festivals, I mean, that makes even more sense that you had this musical connection and you went to them presumably. And you know, I've been to festivals before with Glastonbury and smaller ones as well, and yeah, I've seen the aftermath. It's absolutely insane. And they try so much to tell you to take things with you and this, that, and the other. They provide these, you know, bins for your tents and all that, but it doesn't touch it for these larger festivals. Also, have you thought about wanting to get back into that at any point, or is anyone else swooping in and sort of taking the place of what you were doing? Because that's an interesting problem to keep solving, right?
Yeah. So there's a couple of challenges. One is just like on what you said, like there have been loads of initiatives and they're always targeted at the individual, like take your tent home campaign, like put your tent here, or just like rent a tent or whatever. But it's like you're just like asking them to sacrifice convenience at every turn. Like, and as we know, as individuals, we've sort of innovated through the entire history of our existence to make things more convenient for ourselves. And it's actually one of the big things that I criticize the climate movement on, is that if you continually ask people to sacrifice convenience, we're never going to solve this problem, or not quick enough anyway. But anyway, so yes, I consistently think about it. I definitely don't have, I definitely shouldn't and don't have the time to go and do it now. There are other companies which are like, again, on the fringe, like not paid by events to do this, but they go in and scavenge and good on them, like, and then they repurpose those tents and they, you know, they rent them out and you can like get pre-pitched and blah 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 blah. It's all very good, but the challenge is always just going to be that the pre-pitch stuff is just too expensive for people on top of a festival ticket, particularly if you're like 17 and just out of school. And the second challenge is that after 4 or 5 days of heavy festival going, let's put it that way, I give anyone, like I challenge anyone to have the motivation to pack up like all of their stuff. Like I literally,
it's not like really the first thing that's on your mind, is it?
You just want to get home and get in your bed and have a shower and just like not think about the world and just like be in a dark room for days. And like I totally understand that, and I also don't think that we should ask people to lose the fun of a festival because of the waste that is left. So I actually think, I think that Festovers, which is my previous company, there's a hole for someone to do the same thing. I'd love someone to do it. I'm happy to advise someone doing that. But I also, if it hasn't been done by the point where either Canopy is at a point where I can step back and just let it grow, or we exit, then or it fails, then yes, you know, I of course will look at the things that I understand best and see what I can do to solve them. But again, it's a challenging industry, man. Like festivals, as you'll know, like they're quite structured in the way that they have their contractors, they have their model, and then they just like contracts just come, like it's on a circular basis, and actually to bring in a new model into that is really challenging. So to be able to, like, when we first set up, people were just like, never going to work. People were, you know, festivals will never pay you, and we proved that wrong. But it wasn't easy to get them to prove that wrong. And I think that even with the bigger festivals, particularly, you need to, it's sales ultimately, but also it's a change of sort of like system for them, which is a time, like it's just going to take time for them to do that. So I think, yes, it's needed, but it's not as simple as just like, I'm just going to set up this company and go in and do it. Like the reason that we managed to is because we knew the people running the festival, you know, the festivals that we'd worked at, and that's been great.
Right.
But
having the initial contacts helps, right, rather than going in blind. But it
just
begs the question, which is like, Right. Yeah. But it's the question, which is like, were you doing anything so particularly groundbreaking or different that the festivals themselves couldn't just do?
Well, this is the thing is as well, is that festivals could do this. Like they could set it up so that cleaning companies come in 3 days later. They could have so that they have a team which then like clears all of that into vans and then takes it off to like other places which buy all that material or whatever. The challenge is then they have to, again, like it changes the timeline of the festival. Usually what happens is festival will get to the end of like Sunday night and they'll start packing down straight away, like whilst people are sleeping and leaving on Monday. And then if that's the focus of the festival, they don't really have time to bring in a huge new department, which is going to deal with the aftermath of what's left, which is why they get cleaning companies. Cleaning companies, they pay you, they come in, cleaning companies wipe it all out and it all goes into landfill, sometimes gets recycled, but I'm dubious of that. And you know, so I think that yes, they could do it, but it's actually probably easier for an external company to offer that service to them because then they don't have to think about it. The thing that festivals are missing out on though is that it saves them money to do this. You know, you can pay my old company less money than the cleaning company and then cut the costs of the cleaning company, so then you're lowering your overall costs, but you're also saving all of this waste. And then you could have a revenue share agreement so that as that waste is sold on, the festival could get some of that and they can make money. And it's like it could be very profitable for festivals to actually deal with waste, and it looks great from a PR perspective because they're dealing with a massive environmental issue. But it's a shift. It's a behavioral change, and that takes time. So yes, but also not right now.
Yeah. And on that topic of behavioral change, so to bring it back to the present with Canopy, like you mentioned a couple of times there about people's behaviors, and like we touched on this before when we initially spoke. I'm with you on that one. You know, the fact that getting people to be inconvenienced in some ways on their daily lives is a hard task, because I think this is a huge failure from the climate movement in that regard, and expecting everyone to take individual responsibility to such an extreme, like where it's like it feels like the people saying that don't really fully understand the everyday life of a person in this country, or any country for that matter, where just survival is more of a priority than whether or not they fill up their green bin, or do X or what. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm glad to hear you as a CEO of an organization that's focused on making an impact is aware of that, because all too often I hear the opposite of shifting the blame more on those individuals. Speak a bit more to that if you wouldn't mind. Like how is Canopy sort of fitting into that in a sense, if that if you understand my question.
Totally makes sense. And it's a really important point, because it's challenge. I think just to caveat everything before I say it all is that it's really challenging, right? Like I've studied the climate science, I've worked for an environmental organization, and I deeply understand the problem that we're faced with, even no matter how intangible it is for even climate scientists and even for normal people. Therefore, it's huge, and I think the challenge is always that fundamentally, if let's take all of the preamble of and all of the context of what people want to do just for a minute, let's just take all of that away. Fundamentally, we need a radical and very quick shift away from the way that society works right now, because otherwise we're going to see just impacts which people can't comprehend right now. The planetary crisis isn't just us hyping up or using hyperbole. It is a very real thing which people are going to feel. And one thing that I always tap into is that usually it's right-wing rhetoric to be oh, the climate crisis doesn't matter, we've got other things to focus on, blah 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 blah. And usually then their big focus is migration and all of this bullshit crap. And actually the one thing that I always say is oh, you don't like migrants, do you? Well, actually the climate crisis is going to create more immigrants than ever before within the next 10 years. So if that's all you care about, you should be a climate activist, because fundamentally your borders are going to be absolutely swamped with people who are leaving countries where we could have helped, but we didn't help. And now they're coming to us because we're the place which is less impacted right now. So everyone is impacted by this. That's the first caveat, is just it's hard where I sit because I deeply understand the consumer side, the individual behavior side, like, because I have spoken to so many people and I relate to it on an individual level, but I also very, 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 very deeply understand the climate impact side as well, which is sometimes they conflict sometimes because, you know, most people can't move radically. Anyway, we don't live in this figurative world where there is none of that context. We live in a world where people have wants, have needs, have challenges, and therefore we have to think about what is realistic in order to make impact, to make a change. In the world that we live in, if we ask people to shift the entire economic system, it's not going to take the time that, like, it's not going to happen as quickly as we want it to happen. So that we're talking about 100, 200, 500 year change in sort of like economic change, which we don't have time to wait for. So therefore, what's the next step from that? Okay, if we can't take radical action and we can't save that hit 1.5 degrees, what can we do? Well, then we need to look at the things which are realistic for people to adopt. And this is what Canopy does. And what we do as a company is go, okay, people aren't going to sacrifice convenience and they aren't going to take the time to go and research all of these things, to try and trust all of these claims, to look at the impact, to learn about the swaps they can make, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No one's going to do that. And actually what they want to do is just be able to shop for products which they can trust, have been verified sustainable, and they know that they can feel good whilst buying the products that they want and need, right? And that can be the initial change that we make. And then once everyone is shopping in that way, with less of an impact, but still with convenience, within that model, then you can build in systematic change because people are already bought in then. But if you try and do that before you've given them stepping stones, no one's going to do it. No one's going to jump from the beginning of the alphabet to the end of the alphabet. They're going to go through every little step between that. So we have to give them those steps. So for Canopy, it's fundamentally all about the impact that we have, but not at the sacrifice of convenience. But also, we wouldn't be a company if we couldn't have positive impact with the convenience, right? Like, we just wouldn't start. Like, we don't believe in it. So the way we do it is that currently there's lots of different, as I've said before, lots of different places that you have to go to do lots of different things, and it's far too complicated. There's no trust in the industry. And actually, if we can give the same convenience as something like Amazon, but we can do it in a way where people know that what they see has been verified, and that's very well relayed across everything that we say and do. And also, just like quantifiably see like a data point of like the best products, here's why, like just that purchase, then they're not asked to sacrifice convenience. If anything, they're given an extra incentive to shop on Canopy because it's not asking them to sacrifice anything other than changing the URL they go to. And the difference is then they're buying better products. The challenge that the ethical consumer industry has is price point. So everyone who works in the ethical market has at some point said or heard that it's too expensive to shop sustainably. And if you compare an ethical product, and I put this in inverted commas because what do these terms mean ultimately, but if you compare an ethical product to a non-ethical product, at purchase point, yes, there is a price uptick on the ethical product for lots of reasons, which most people don't care about because they just see the price. But it's not fair to judge them at purchase point against each other because of all those reasons, yes, but also because almost all of the ethical products that you buy are going to last you longer. And if they're like cleaning cosmetics or anything like that, they're refillable. So instead of having to go again and buy that same product at purchase point every single time, the ethical one, you just buy once and then you buy refills. But the mainstream one, you have to buy again and again and again. And a really good example of this is a reusable water bottle. Buy a reusable water bottle for a really good quality one with good sustainable materials made, you're probably going to have to spend somewhere between like 30 and 45 pounds, which feels like a bigger chunk of money compared to like a single-use plastic bottle that you can get from Tesco. But you can refill a reusable water bottle, and the life cycle of a reusable water bottle replaces approximately 1,470 single-use plastic bottles. Now, if you compare the price of 1,470 single-use plastic bottles to that one reusable bottle you bought, you've saved yourself over £1,000 as a consumer over the life cycle of that. And if we can show that to people, then it's not just about the sustainability, it's not just about the convenience, it's also the fact that you can save money by buying better products. Then actually we have a far better chance at converting people into being ethical consumers without them even feeling themselves as ethical consumers, because you're tapping into the fundamental things that consumers like, which is convenience, price, and feel-good factor. If we can do those things, then it makes it much easier to lessen the impact of the consumer industry. That's my rant.
But no, but that was a good answer. And but it's difficult, isn't it? Because that price point, that part that you mentioned, I think everything else is clear, right? Super clear out of that. But the price point thing is a difficult one because of for a lot of people, who are on a tight budget, which, let's face it, there are a lot more of than ever right now. Spending £30 on a water bottle, part of a weekly or monthly shop, isn't tenable, right? So you get that choice. It's like, I think a lot of people understand, if you buy quality, that it's going to save you money, right? Like it's the difference between going to a clothes store that sells good quality clothes that's going to last and not break, versus going to a Primark and buying something that is probably going to fall apart in a month. But people know that, I think, but it isn't always up to them. It's up to their budget, and they go, I'd love to do that, but this is a bigger outlay right now, which I just can't justify. But like I personally have, in my life, for example, in my buying behaviors, I've tried in the last sort of 5 to 7 years to make those slightly bigger purchases for things that are going to last me a bit longer. I mean, great example, my PC that just died today, but anyway, doesn't always work out. But I'm fortunate enough to be in that position, having worked for it, and I'm also sensible about it in the sense that I'm not just going to go and buy all of those things in one hit, like you try and spread it out. But it's just who's got the time to sit and think about these things? I understand the fact that I'm in a privileged position to do that, and so but I suppose what you're getting at maybe is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that at least if you're eliminating some of the other things that people have to take the time or the energy or the money to think about, then at least you're just presenting them with one thing, as opposed to a myriad of things that would otherwise overwhelm people. And so you can then let them decide on the price point side of things, right?
Absolutely. But also the point that it doesn't have to be a product which is 10 times higher than the alternative, right? Like a reusable water bottle at purchase point is extensively more expensive in that first purchase, but cleaning products aren't. Cleaning, if you buy a cleaning product on the Canopy website, which then uses refills rather than just you're having to buy the same bottle again and again, actually you're probably only talking about like a couple of pounds more that month, like an entire month. And actually that's the conversation that we should have, that it doesn't need to be huge changes. It doesn't need to, and you mentioned it as well, like not everything at once as well. We can talk about the smallest possible change that a consumer can make, which is the cleaning product they use, let's say. And then actually the refills after that are cheaper than every other cleaning product you could buy on the market, in the mainstream market. So then so you've spent like £2 maybe more that month. Or maybe it's over 3 months and you've just put like 30p aside, like, or whatever, like 50p aside every month, and then you make that one change, and then suddenly your impact as a consumer has drastically gone down anyway. But also, instead of thinking it from an individual perspective as well, you think about, well, if everyone in my street did that, or everyone in the city that I live in did that, just one change, then that's a huge impact. And I think that this is another thing that the climate movement, I'm not here to berate the climate movement because I'm part of it, and I work with these people still, and I think that they're doing a fantastic job, just generally in the climate space. But the other thing that we fail to talk about is that you don't need to be perfect as a consumer, as an individual. We can make small changes as individuals, and if everybody makes those small changes, that's enough. But we do have to make a small change at some point. But the difference is that it shouldn't be a small change of like sacrificing convenience or sacrificing capital or anything like that. It should be a small change that you can justify in that moment, that makes a shift for your lifetime, and then that will have a bigger impact. You're right. When it comes to I actually find the clothes one difficult, because the new clothes, just at a base level, it's not particularly ethical right now with the materials we use to consistently buy new clothes generally, even if they are really good quality clothes. The difference is as well, though, is that a really good quality piece of clothing is exponentially more expensive than fast fashion, like ridiculously more expensive. So it's a really hard one.
It doesn't seem to be a middle ground.
It's not.
It's either ridiculously cheap and way up there.
So the encouragement with things that you don't need to buy, new, is that always try and buy secondhand, always rent, always do these things where you still get access to them. You can still have them. You can still look great and talk about it all and talk about the brand that you're wearing, but you're just not having to buy them up front. And even if it's fast fashion, you don't buy it up front, because then you're not contributing to new waste and all of that stuff. The challenge again, though, just with like the clothing industry, is that actually it's less of a consumer thing that we need to talk about, and more of the materials that we use and what happens to those materials at the end of life. And that's not really down to the individual, that's down to businesses and governments working together. And that, I think that will change over time. I think that the other thing is, I mentioned there was sort of within certain markets, there's the idea of loaning or renting or swapping, and that's actually also something that people can get involved in, because it doesn't cost usually as much. It's cheaper to do, but also you still get that convenience of what you want when you want it. But the thing is,
great people on the podcast, you know, other founders for businesses doing, you know, working in those sort of similar spaces for upcycling, for swapping and all that kind of thing. So there's some great innovators out there tackling that problem as well.
You want when you want it. But the thing is,
great people on the podcast, you know, other founders.
100%, and it's really important because we need that side of things. The challenge, of course, is that again, that side of the market is great at talking about the fact that everyone should swap secondhand, but also probably wouldn't want to buy a secondhand deodorant or a secondhand makeup or a secondhand cleaning product. And
it depends who the previous owner was. If we had a bit of information, then it might be all right, you know.
All right, dude, you do you. I'm going to make the statement that I'm not buying someone else's roll-on deodorant, but you can do.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite fair. Yeah, it depends what you're into, though, I suppose, doesn't it?
I suppose, yeah. There's definitely some people getting a good old sniff of that.
There's a market for everything. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
But the point is that there is always, well, at the moment, there's going to be a demand for new products, because you can't replace that like with a second-hand market. So therefore, in that situation, you've got to think about, okay, what is an affordable replacement? So looking at refills and everything else, but also an ethical replacement. Are they the good materials? All of those things, have it been checked? But you as a consumer shouldn't have to do any of that. Like, that should be done for you, and there should be a place which you can find all those things, knowing that that's been checked, but also being able to see that impact, and also being able to see the money you could save. And that's what Canopy is building.
Yeah, and it's I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it's the right approach, like we've touched on already. But I want to ask you about something you mentioned a bit earlier, and at the risk of getting into potentially contentious waters, but I think it's important to talk about, which is, you know, you spoke about the climate crisis as a whole, and how it's it is urgent, right? That it is a crisis, and that you weren't being hyperbolic, I think you said. But I want to ask you, what's your opinion on this sort of the newer rhetoric that I've certainly noticed, and presumably you have too, in especially the last year, with a lot of people, primarily from the right, but I'm also seeing from the left, talking about how this crisis feels like it's been over-egged, it's been oversold, and it's being sort of dubbed as the climate lie. It's being, you know, made to be a bit of more of an alarmist thing. And this, look, I'll be completely honest, where I stand on this is where I stand with most things, right? I'm generally quite centrist on things. The reason being is I completely admit the fact that I'm just a fucking idiot, right? I don't know enough, and I don't feel confident enough quite often on a topic to say definitively one way or the other. I'm just very open to the information. And so hearing this stuff from this new sort of line of rhetoric, I was kind of like, okay, yeah, I mean, that sounds plausible, to be honest. And then equally, it sounds very plausible. You know, I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't know, right? So, but what's your take on that? Because presumably you're beginning to encounter this, or have encountered this. So,
I mean,
so what's your take? Is there some truth to that?
So no, but there's also that isn't a new take. It's just that they've got more platform to talk about it. But what I would just ask very quickly before answering is, do you drive?
I do, yes. Not very well, but I do.
That's fine. Are you a mechanic?
No.
When your car breaks, do you fix it yourself?
Depends
when
on
we're
what
talking about like a big break, you know, like you need a new
no.
Who do you go to?
Well, my dealership, my mechanic. Yeah.
And would you say that they're experts in dealing with mechanics on cars?
Usually, yeah.
Is that why you trust them?
Because they are trained experts, they have the experience. Yeah, I see where you're going with this, and I've got a response to that.
They spent their lives doing it, right?
Yeah.
And there's your mechanic who you go to, but there are also mechanics globally, right? Like in every country, in every city, that have pretty much the same skills and have the same concept on how to fix those things, right? You take it to your mechanic, but you could take it to a mechanic in Japan and they probably do the same fix. I would probably expect. They might have some other fancy new tech, but essentially they're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
What I struggle with, therefore, is that you're not a climate scientist, as you've stated. You haven't spent your career learning about these things. 99.8% of climate scientists globally agree on the gravitas of the situation. It's just data, it's just a fact. Why, therefore, do we go, could be plausible that the 0.2% of scientists who have been disproved and their peer reviews have been debunked, let's just clear that as well, why is their argument more plausible than the people that we should respect in their academia and expertise? In the same way that if I today put out a YouTube video telling you that the way that your mechanic was fixing your clutch was incorrect, and actually you should do it this way because actually a clutch isn't broken, like it's a lie. So it's not real. That clutch thing that you're feeling, that's not to do with your clutch. Like, don't be ridiculous. That's completely exaggerated by your mechanic. You would not believe me. You would not listen to me, and you go to your mechanic and you say, no, this idiot. This is what the climate movement is dealing with on a daily basis, in that these people who have no academic background in this area, and if they do, they've been debunked, have managed to convince a group of well-meaning people that the entire climate community is exaggerating the gravitas of this situation, which is entirely bullshit. Look, we have climate models which are estimates. We have theory which isn't fact, because in science, you never say fact. When you go to the doctor, you don't question the medicine they give you generally. I mean, obviously through the pandemic, we saw that as well, which is a whole other argument, but let's not get into that. But the point is that the climate is one of the only topics in history that we've ever seen sort of experts being told that their opinion is, their facts and their theory at the highest level of academia and the highest level of scientific theory is probably exaggerated. Why? Like, where's this coming from? Because these people know a lot more than me, and definitely more than most people, on what's going on. So I really struggle with when I see YouTube videos and I've spoken to people with that argument. I've spoken to them in my entire career, for Greenpeace particularly, because we speak with a lot of people with that rhetoric, and they are wrong. And it's not bad to call that out, because, generally when we have like debates and arguments, to say the other side is wrong is like bad etiquette. You don't generally do that. You listen to the other side, you hear their response. But if they're selling disinformation and they are factually incorrect, you have to call it out for what it is. And they are incorrect, they are wrong, and they're extremely dangerous, because what we're seeing in the UK is fuck all compared to what countries around the world are seeing. To give you an example of this, a real life example, my partner's Malaysian, and she has grown up in Malaysia and now she lives in the UK because she came here for university. The palm oil industry in Indonesia uses a technique called slash and burn, whereby they go to the rainforest, they cut it down, then they burn it and release all of the carbon dioxide and all of the stored greenhouse gas back into the atmosphere, which has a huge climate impact in itself. But regardless of that, it's causing huge biodiversity damage in the area. That's all bad in itself, right? But in Southeast Asia, there is now an entire season that has been created by human action called haze season, whereby when this happens, it changes the local climate so that you are surrounded by toxic fumes, like haze is what they call it. And it's not actually livable, but because people live there, they just have to deal with it. That's not hyperbole. That's not exaggeration. That is direct climate response from the world, from the atmosphere that we live in, dealing with the impacts of humans. And that's just one example of many that I could give you, where these things are very real to like billions of people around the world. So when we sit in the UK and we go, yeah, but it's not that bad because like X, Y, and Z, like these people are exaggerating because I haven't seen it. Like it's just fundamentally an untruth. So I take a really hard stance against this just because it's actually very dangerous, because people like yourself, who you say centrist, not sitting on either side of the political spectrum, whatever, you can make that decision. But the point is that you are at risk of being misled by people who are lying to you for political gain.
Well, just to be clear, yeah. I'm with you on the mechanic side of things, right? I generally will usually side with experts in the world, like people who, which is again part of the reason why I don't claim to be an authority on many things of anything. Because I am not an expert. I'm not a climate scientist or a scientist of any kind. So I hold a lot of stock in people who have studied and trained and worked in certain areas, across the board for anything, especially on the climate issue. So while I say I'm a centrist on that to a degree, I'm centrist on the politics of it, I think is what I mean more than anything else. When it comes to science, then I'm going to believe those who have the background and the IQ and everything that goes with it. I mean, I'm generally going to believe the scientific consensus, but that's not to say there isn't flaws within the scientific community. There are a ton.
Well, of course. Don't get me wrong.
And that's also not to say that I don't think as an individual, I'm not allowed to question the information I'm given to a degree, but not in a way that that in any way sort of acts as if or to presume that I know any better. It is just simply like, can you give me the additional information if I have the time or the desire to learn a bit more about it? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We've got to hold people to account, even those who know more than us about certain things. So just to clarify on that, but it is also worth saying that there is a slight flaw with the mechanic argument, which is a lot of people get screwed over by mechanics. So I'm just saying.
Only on price though.
Right, there are agendas, and even looking at the scientific community on a global scale, there are certain countries that will produce scientific results based on pressures from political parties, not always Western, but you can understand the skepticism. I understand skepticism of the daily person, again, going about their life focusing on survival. You understand the skepticism when you see a certain level of corruption either in current Western society or around the world, and it opens up, it just makes it like the cards are, everything's off the table at that point for people. And so that's when you get conspiracy theories and misinformation rampant, because everyone's ready to believe it. That's the problem with misinformation. Everyone's ready to have a contrarian view, and that's the whole thing.
I agree. Right? I have actually two things to say on that, which is that you're absolutely right. So through the history of scientific to society sort of studies, and through the history of science and the relationship between society, there's been sort of like three sort of phases of that. And one was originally science was seen as like this thing which the lay person, the average person wouldn't understand. So therefore science was dictated upon people, and people would respect that to the highest order. And that was just the way that the world worked. But then as more and more sort of investigative journalism came out, and more sort of like understanding of how science is funded and all of these things began to sort of like rear their heads, we had a understandable and absolutely needed question of why we should just take things at face value and never question things, because you absolutely should always question everything. And that led to a sort of like change of shift where science and scientists and the scientific community realized that they needed to engage with society, because they needed people to understand like where they were coming from when it was actually truthful. Like they didn't want people to then go, oh yeah, but that time you lied, so what about this time, are you lying again? Like that was really important that they didn't have that. So then they again started discussing with society, but it was still very linear. It was like, we will ask them their opinion, and then that's fine. We've asked them their opinion, and now we can carry on. And then we entered this sort of like new age of sort of like scientific and science and technology studies, whereby it was all about sort of co-creation, co-productionist, which is where we engaged civilians into the scientific world in order to co-create scientific theory based on both academia and lay knowledge. And one of the biggest triggers for that was actually after the Chernobyl crisis. So Chernobyl happened, there was acid rain that came over from the east. Farmers in the Lake District said that their land and their livestock had been contaminated, and scientists said, no, originally that's not possible. It can't happen. The theory isn't there. There's no way that it would still be contaminating after it had reached that point. And eventually the farmers were like, well, here's the proof. Like, what do you want from us? And we're like, oh, okay, they're actually, what they're saying is true. So therefore, okay, let's put a theory in place. And we say, well, based on the soil in the UK, it should stop being contaminated within this period of time. So therefore, we'll ban livestock sales for that period of time, and then we'll open it back up again. And farmers said, well, actually, no, but in the Lake District, the soil is different. We've been farming this land for generations, and it doesn't work quite like that. So the way that it works is X, Y, and Z. And scientists said, no, like central government scientists said, no, like, you know, we've got the science, here it is. And they were wrong again. And then eventually it came to the point where the farmers and the scientists collaborated to work out what was the best way in order to make sure that the livestock industry could continue without the contamination impacting and eventually obviously reaching humans. And that was the only time that that sort of like triggered the need for lay knowledge to come into the scientific community. Now, the reason I give you all of this is because that hasn't stopped. Scientific communities around the world are still co-producing science with people, but also still there are groups which are purely funded and just do their science and then release it and and say it peer reviewed, but it's peer reviewed by the same people.
It depends on the science, presumably, right? You know,
right.
And what it is that they're researching into. Yeah.
But the point I'm getting to, Greg, is that with climate science and with the climate narrative, if that's what you want to call it, is that it's not just coming from one scientific community. It's coming from 99.8% of scientists globally who are funded by various different organizations, various different governments, various different incentives, various different humans, and they all come to the same theory. Anthropogenic climate change is real, and the level and the gravitas of that situation is dire, and it's unequivocally caused by humans, and we should not and cannot challenge that at the threat of our own existence. That is the stance, because that is the theory. That is what's been proved again and again, regardless of who's funded it. So whether your mechanic is trying to trick you, I can guarantee you that not every single mechanic in the world is trying to trick you. And that's the same with the scientists. Yeah, there might be one group which is funded by some like whack job fucking guy who just wants to push a narrative. But, oh, look at that. It also happens to be the same narrative that every single group which isn't in line with that person is also saying, and therefore that's why peer review studies exist now, because that didn't exist previously. It previously was that science could be determined, people would come through. And a good example of this in the healthcare industry is the whole sort of like MMR and autism studies that were done by Andrew Wakefield. He released them, he said it was true, it caused a huge amount of disruption in the medical industry, and then everything was peer reviewed and he was disproved. And then he was barred from being a doctor because of it. That's exactly what's happening in the climate industry. It's climate scientists that are coming out, and I note that you say that there's like funding for this agenda and blah 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 blah, but I'm sure you're also aware that that's the same for the people who are saying the other side. In fact, it's been proven that the scientists that are coming out against the climate narrative are funded by the oil industry, by the automotive industry, by the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, that was going to be, yeah, it's funny you said that, because that was going to be my next question. Like, what do you think the motivation is behind that? I mean, and I think the obvious one is, okay, industry, but beyond that, like, is there any more to it? Is there any more substance to the motivation behind the narrative there? And why people are so willing to believe it?
Literally money and time. So the reason I say that is that for oil companies, car industry's changed a little bit, because originally the car industry was like super sort of anti-climate, like, and would be pushing sort of a narrative of like, this is extreme, like we don't need to move towards. But now they've like actually seen that they can't like argue with it, and actually there's a market for them, right? So their shift purely came because they went, oh, actually we can make a market out of this new industry, so let's actually go in and support it. So either way, they're biased by their greed and biased by their money. Oil companies are interesting because for oil companies, they are starting to fund like renewables and a shift away from oil and gas, which shows that they know they need to. But the point is they can't do it quick enough to justify the climate narrative. So therefore what they do is they push out and fund climate science, which is not climate science, it is just picking data and cherry picking so that they want to choose to back up their own agenda. And then what they do is that they can go, so therefore we've actually got more time to do this. We still need to do it. They're not going to argue that. They'll go, we still need to do it. It's not that they're wrong, it's just that they're extreme. Like we've actually got 100 years, not 50 years. And that gives them time as an industry to shift. But luckily for them, they're usually based in countries which aren't going to be impacted by the climate crisis right now. So they can afford to go, well, it's bad, but like, let's not worry about what's going to happen over the next 100 years, but let's just make sure that we have time to transition in a time frame that we want, whilst still being extremely rich, whilst still making profit, whilst people are paying more on their bills than ever. Like these are the companies which are, you know, I feel like I'm just ranting a little bit, but the point is that they essentially, it's not that they deny what's happening, it's that they will try and lead people to believe that it's not as extreme as the climate community says it is, right? Because that gives them time. It gives them time to make money and to transition. But we don't have time. So it's like, or at least the majority of the world doesn't have time, right? So this is the challenge. It's just that most of this right-wing rhetoric, and I am yet to have met a left-wing sort of scientist that agrees with that right-wing rhetoric, if I'm honest, but maybe there are. But they generally are pushing, got to the point where it used to be just push against the narrative entirely and say that it's false. That has changed over the last 30 years to now be like, oh, it's not false, it's just not extreme. So we can wait, we can take time. And I can guarantee in 10 years time, they're going to be like, oh, no, it's extreme, we need to change like super rapidly. Let's blame someone. Let's blame other people. And I mean, you see that already, right? Like, let's blame China. Let's blame us. Let's blame Saudi Arabia because they're the oil company. They're not selling oil to us, so it's their fault, right? Like, actually, no. You know, we need to take responsibility.
Well, and that's the easy thing to do, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, you hear a lot about 100%. That of like, you know, when America is put on the spot for its effects on climate, then they always point to India and China, and you know, when the UK is pointed out, we always do the same. It's like, it's, you know, I mean, that's just a completely useless way of arguing the point. It's like, you know, it's like shouting at a kid and telling them off for doing something naughty and then pointing another kid, well, they did it. It's like, well, that's not really the point of what we're talking about right now. We're talking about your responsibility, and it's a very easy thing to do, to shift the blame. But at the end of the day, it's everyone's responsibility to take part and be proactive. So do you feel like the UK is doing enough? I mean, let's focus on the UK. It's where we live, right? So do you feel like the UK is doing enough and doing its part in terms of its policies and where it's allocating its funding to tackle this issue, or does it need to do more?
The whole world needs to do more. So that's not a UK thing. I'm not going to sit here and say that the UK is bad in what it's doing, because it's a global issue. But the UK had some policies which it had implemented, which were semi-positive, put it that way. And within a semi-positive timeline, I note that there's an independent advisory body to the government called the Climate Change Committee, and they're set up so that they can give and relay sort of data and audit on policy and on the impacts of that policy to government, to tell them whether they're online with the legal commitment that you've made as a country for your net zero targets. And to note that they have been, so before all the changes that recently came, they released a report that said that we were nowhere near on track to that legal commitment, and with these semi-positive policies. So it just showed that, like, yes, we've got some good stuff going on, but like, even if we just remove like the niche for a minute, like as an overall, we're really not doing enough, just from a legal basis as well. Then Rishi Sunak decided to backtrack on a load of those policies, or delay a load of those policies. And if I'm honest with you, Greg, like, it was the most shocking like announcement to our community, like the climate science community, because it was just like, you set up, you know, governments have set up these advisory boards and various sort of climate science globally feeds into these, so that then we can relay that information, relay that data, so that policy can be determined on for the better of society. And you just blatantly ignored it. And that has really, really just like shot the UK's targets sort of in the foot for now. I don't think that that's the end of it. I think that the UK could come back from that. I think that they've seen, I'm part of a group chat for COP28 organization with a whole bunch of UK-based businesses and European-based leaders and scientists. And when that announcement came out from Rishi Sunak, there was a letter that went around which had been signed by hundreds of the world's largest companies and the world's most influential sort of politicians, saying that like this is not you have not got a mandate to do this from anyone. No, not in the business world. So don't try and claim that it's a business thing, because we're stood here as business people and not startups. Like, you know, my company meant nothing on that list, but I'm talking about like huge companies, which, you know, that letter is probably somewhere circulating online, but that are fundamentally taking a stance and saying your agenda, your ideological agenda, as like as either a prime minister or as a party, like whether you want to differentiate those two, that's up to the person listening, but that is not backed by business, and that, or the majority of business, and that is not backed by the people. And what's really interesting within that is that the whole rhetoric around these changes was that, oh, it's for society. Like, we're going to try and bring energy bills down by getting 100 new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea, and we're going to reduce our climate targets from 2030 to 2035, or in some cases to 2050. And it's like, this is all to do with the fact that it's the cost of living crisis. But most of that oil and gas that you're drilling in the North Sea is being exported, and then we have to buy it back at a more expensive amount, meaning actually it's going to rise the cost of energy bills, increase the cost of energy bills, not lower them. So fundamentally, from a data perspective, it's just incorrect. So whether we're talking about the climate or whether we're talking about the cost of living crisis, these policies did nothing for nobody other than the ideological sort of lobbying from oil and gas companies, which we know put money behind sort of the current politicians in government. So yes,
yeah,
UK,
and that's a huge problem, isn't it? And that's the thing I think that's most disheartening to most people around this topic, is that because of there's such a what's the word, symbiotic relationship, let's say, between politics and these industries, that there's a sense of like that nothing will really ever be able to effectively change without either a pretty serious shake-up of the way that the country is fundamentally structured, or until it's too late, right? I mean, human beings are pretty good at reacting to things once they go wrong, but not so good at reacting to them preemptively, because again, like to your point about visualization, we're not very good at that. You know, the scientific community that's their job. And that's part of the thought process of being scientifically minded, but generally speaking, especially if you're only working on a 4-year basis, right, which politicians
this is the challenge, right?
Right. So what would you say is the solution there? Because of, you know, look, I'm interested in solving problems, right? That's and I think you are too. I mean, that's why you're a founder. We're in this business where, I mean, I don't know any founder that doesn't hold the same sort of philosophy as me, which as a founder too, which is, you know, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. So what would you say are the solutions, or the solutions, or the solution to that very fundamental, I mean, corruption, I guess you could call it, but it is within law, so it's not technically corruption.
I mean, I can't give you a silver bullet. I think that this is a huge topic, which, you know,
Well, maybe silver bullets are part of the answer.
Well, I'm not going to condone that on a video. But you know,
that's the great thing about being a podcast host. I can say what the fuck I like, and I don't care. So I'll say it. Maybe that's
you
part
say,
of the
say what you want, Greg. Just full disclaimer, that was not my voice. Okay.
I'll put that in a quote when I share the clip. So Thomas Panton said. Bullets are the only answer in the I am of course joking to anyone listening. Calm down.
No, so I think I think fundamentally, so I have a little bit of a sort of anecdotal part here, which is that sat on hosted a panel at the London Climate Technology Show last month, I think it was, and I sat on a panel with someone from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, someone from EY consultancy, from a hydrogen truck company, and someone from a renewable energy sort of like community-based company. And this was just after the announcement for Rishi and the Conservatives, and everyone in this room was against what that policy had now changed to. But the fundamental thing that came up in the conversations of like, okay, we can sit here and slate the government all we want, but this is what they're doing. What do we do now? And the thing that came up again and again and again was collaboration without the reliance on government, basically. If we can't rely on government to bring in reasonable and effective policy and regulation, then we as a business community and as citizens have to do that ourselves. It's why you have citizens law, it's why you have citizen assemblies, it's why you have business forums, it's why you have business advisory boards, is that you can effectively do everything that the government should be doing without them needing to be there. Now, I'm not a free market capitalist. I don't believe in non-regulation. I think that fundamentally, if we're going to change, solve the climate crisis, but also solve lots of other societal issues, I think we need regulation, and we need policy, and we need government, and we need incentives, and we need investment from government. We need all of those things, and we need them to work with business. We need them to work with systems. But whilst we wait, there's no point in us waiting and just shouting and throwing rocks at their 10 Downing Street. We should complain and we should protest, but we should also be proactive and start building. So I think that the sort of glimmer of hope within all of this was that coming out of that conference, and then any other conference that I've been speaking at recently as well, is that there's a lot happening just like away from government, where people are really driving forward change without having to wait. It's challenging, and actually the biggest challenge of that is that if the government isn't incentivizing companies, then it makes it more expensive for us to do these things. Eyes on sort of the wealthy of the world, the angel investors, the VCs and the institutional money, to basically be the government money and to support longer term visions and to change their theses and all of these things, which is another shift, which will come in time. But I think we're already starting to see that. We're starting to see companies which we saw VCs which were set up as like impact VCs just generically with the same thesis, who are now like hard climate tech VCs with like huge long waits until they get their returns. Like they're not there for a like 6-7 year return. They're there for like a 15, 20, 25 year return, because they understand the money that needs to go into these companies, and they understand the return that they will get will be better if they let it mature. So I think we're seeing that shift, and that gives me a lot of hope. I think that generally in the startup world as well, we're seeing like a lot of great initiatives come out which are going to help solve this problem, not just for like from a climate perspective, but from an individual perspective. We talk about Canopy being about tying convenience with sustainable shopping, because for us, yes, impact, as I say, is like the foundation of everything we do, but our main focus is what do individuals want, what do people want? And people want convenience, people want easier price points, people want to not have to do loads of research. Well, if we can give them all of that, but it also is positive impact, then we're going to make a shift without people even really needing to change anything. And that is what I'm seeing a lot in the space, is not just for consumers, but for businesses as well, startups who are creating, I advise a startup called Pulpatronics, and they've designed a RFID tag, which, if you don't know what an RFID tag is, basically for scanning security for clothing and consumer products at retail stores. So when you walk out and it beeps, like usually from an RFID tag, or if you're scanning it into a till or whatever, it's usually an RFID tag, and they have like metal chips in them. They're super, super bad for the planet and all of these things. They've designed a new one, which is exponentially less impact, but also cheaper. So what's really interesting is they've innovated this great climate solution, but they understand that businesses, at the end of the day, it's all about their bottom line, it's about the money. And they innovated a climate solution whilst making it convenient and accessible for businesses to adopt. That's the sort of thing that excites me, because it's not pushing back against industry. It's working with what industry wants and with what consumers want to then give them solutions which are better for the planet. So that's how I think we solve that. I would love, of course, government to also get on board with that, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
And you know what? I 100% agree with everything you said there. I have the same opinion in regards to the way that we can move the needle here, and I think that the answer lies in enterprise. And I actually spoke on this very recently, and in fact, I think I've got a post coming out tomorrow where I put a clip from the episode of this that's coming out. I mean, by the time this airs, it'll be maybe a month or two ago, nice. But an episode of speaking with a founder who's in a similar space to yours, doing something similar in terms of a platform, but for the high street So to be able to make the right choices based on data done for you on the places you visit locally, which is another thing, right? Another element of it. And I do see, and I've got a great vantage point speaking to as many founders as I do on a daily and weekly basis, that when I encounter individuals like you innovating in these different spaces, you can start seeing the bigger picture. And actually, once all of these smaller innovations are implemented and grow and blow up in their respective markets, that you end up with a holistic approach to attacking a problem. And I think that is the way forward, because that will put pressure on the government eventually. You know, when you have organizations that say, like a clothes shop, that suddenly are working with all these different startups to solve all these different problems, and then they collectively go to the governments and say, hey, we have actually managed to not only lower our carbon emissions and lower our waste, but we're making more money. Our employees are happier, and It's like, now you need to support us and listen to us. They can't say no, because suddenly that is more powerful, and there's more probably economic opportunity for the government there, as well as the sort of social capital that they give, than the oil companies of the world can now offer. It needs to be the balance needs to shift, and I think it will. It's just going to take a lot of time, and it takes more innovative individuals like you. And just one final thought, I guess, to on this as well, is you mentioned activism there, and the right to protest and so on. I have always had a very mixed relationship with activism. I used to be something of an activist when I was younger, going to protests and all that, and I become slightly disillusioned with it, because at some point I realized that it's about talking. Talking a good game is one thing, but what am I actually doing about it? And when you realize that you're protesting against an organization that really doesn't give a shit about what you have to say and how long you stand out in the rain and do anything, then what you're doing is entirely, it comes to a point where it feels like you're virtue signaling. If you are or you're not, it feels like a bit of a waste of time. And ultimately what I say to people who are interested in activism is, if you've got a skill set you can contribute toward achieving that goal, that to me is a better use of your time and resources than it is to go and stand outside in the pissing rain or getting arrested and getting a criminal record, in my view. And that's not to say there isn't a place for activism. There absolutely is, and there are a lot of times where that's made effective change. But I think for issues like this, put that energy to use. I feel, right? Put that energy to use. Go and make the change that you want to see. Asking others to do it for you feels it feels like slightly hypocritical in my view. Sometimes, not always. Sometimes.
I tend to sort of mostly agree. I think that the way that activism can work effectively is when hundreds of thousands of people turn up and show their support for something. It
draws attention to an issue, right?
It draws attention, but it also shows physically a pressure, without it being right. An email, or it's there are I was on a march recently and there was over 150,000 people there outside Downing Street. There's no way that you can ignore it, right? Whereas 150,000 people sending you an email.
My point is though, you're taking part in that, but you are also doing what you are doing.
So what I was going to say was,
when it's a career as an activist, it's it becomes a point where it's I think that presence is important. I absolutely do, and I agree. It makes it known that it's an issue, and it attracts media attention and all that. But it's when people are for some reason upset that isn't doing the job. It's well, you need to be doing. If you're really serious about this, do more.
I agree,
and you're doing so much. It's one element of the things that you're doing. You know what I mean?
What I was going to say was that it doesn't it shouldn't, and usually isn't as well, just one thing though, right? Protest doesn't go alone. It shouldn't be alone. Generally what's the challenge has been is that, for example, with Greenpeace was sort of thrown into the same sort of bag as the likes of Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. But Greenpeace, the activism that they do is usually targeted at businesses and governments, and it only happens after a company has refused to work with Greenpeace, because 98% of the work that Greenpeace does is in a boardroom with a roadmap, looking at financial charts, trying to work out a good transition for that company to make, which is both impactful and efficient. But people don't see that. So what they see is the activism stuff, and they go, "Oh, all you guys do is activism. What a waste of time." But that's not true. They're not. They spend most of their time working on actually more serious things than any of us do. So I think that you're right, but I also think it would be incorrect to assume that all activists, or not all activists, but even some activists, don't do anything else. They're not consistently doing actions. They're not there every single day. They are out there in certain periods of time, and that might, even if they are out there every single day, they're out there for like a couple of hours in the day, and then they're doing other things, usually working, or if they're kids, they're usually at school, right? And so I think that it would be wrong to assume that just because they are very vocal about activism, and because their activist stuff might not be stuff that we want to do, or stuff that we feel comfortable doing, doesn't mean that they're not doing other things. Like, I know plenty of people who work or have worked or been involved with Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, who are phenomenally impressive in the work that they do as well. A really good example of that is there's a guy who is at every single Extinction Rebellion march, every single Extinction Rebellion protest. He's also a climate scientist of the highest regard in his industry. And I think that, you know, we can't assume that the people on the streets aren't doing other stuff. I actually think that the reason they're on the streets is usually through desperation of, like, the work that they've been doing isn't being heard, or hasn't made a big enough impact.
Yeah, I feel like they're sort of banging their head up against the wall a little bit.
Yeah.
No, and look,
which is challenging, right?
Clear, I'm not saying that is the case, but we are seeing, but this nicely ties into something else I wanted to ask you, and you almost touched on it a bit there as well, which is, you know, there is that we have to admit that, you know, that there is a movement on the left which is taking things slightly too far. That there is a new wave of activism and a new wave of leftism, if you want to call it, which does seem to be focused more on the social capital that it gains them, as opposed to the real issues, in my opinion. And I know I've spoken to these people, right? And they are unfortunately misrepresenting, in my view, some very, very serious issues, issues that I fully support and believe in. And I think they're doing a huge disservice to those issues and even undercutting some of the validity, and probably, you know, helping with the spreading of a lot of this misinformation we talked about, and you know, contributing to the way people are being more receptive to the other side of the information to some degree. So, you know, and a great example of that for me, and I don't know what your opinion on this, but for me, is Just Stop Oil, right? I put them in that camp. And that's not to say that I think everyone in that organization is like that. I think there are some very well educated, like you just pointed out, some very well educated, very well meaning individuals there who have the right ideas to a degree. But unfortunately, that movement is garnering a lot of support from a lot of individuals who quite frankly, you know, don't really care about the issue, aren't doing anything themselves to solve the issue. They're virtue signaling, basically. And I would say that I don't support the way that they go about their protests, largely. What is your stance on that? And do you have much of an insight into that? Because you must, being the space you're in, you must encounter individuals like that, right? They do exist. This isn't something that I've just imagined, right?
No. Yeah, they do exist. I think it's a very small minority. They're loud, but they're small. I think that,
and that's the problem. They're loud, so they look like the majority. That's the problem.
But also, you know, you can say that about like any sort of like any movement, really. There's always like a fringe group which is louder than the rest, and they get the most media attention. But that doesn't mean that the whole movement is doing that. I think that there's two things. Like, one thing is it's undeniable that they've brought an attention to the movement. That hasn't always been positive attention, but hey, we're talking about it. So I think that through, you know, the last 50 years of climate movements and activism, there's only been relative media coverage of all of that, and now it is like full frontal, you know, just like always. And most of the media rhetoric is very negative around their actions, but again, it gets people talking about why they're doing what they're doing. In terms of the actions they take, I tend to agree. Like, I think that it disenfranchises more than it engages, which is a problem. And the reason for that, though, is kind of less the action in itself, and more that they don't have like a follow-on, like here's how we solve it. It's like everything's shit, bad for driving a car, the end. And actually, that's really unproductive.
It's just pure guilt tripping and victimization. It's not.
Well, it doesn't work. I mean, even in our own sector, you know, the general rhetoric in the ethical consumer market has been like, oh, if you buy from Amazon, you're bad. And it's like, well, actually, no. Like, yes, of course, Amazon's bad, and we all know that. But also, it's super convenient, and like they have everything I need, so I get it. You know, so it's not about saying, oh, you're bad for doing this. It's saying this is a bad thing, but here's a solution. You make the choice as an individual what you want to do. And then, as I say, without all of the sacrifice that usually comes with that, if we can get rid of that sacrifice, then great. I think that my challenge is that, like, generally, like, there doesn't seem to be like a unified target on these things. Like, my opinion initially when Just Stop Oil started was, great, you're targeting the automobile industry, probably better that you target the manufacturers and the actual automobile industry rather than people who are just driving cars. But that doesn't even seem to be the rhetoric anymore. The rhetoric just seems to be like, climate's dying, I'm standing in the middle of the road. And I get that for a lot of people, I don't think it would be right to say that they don't care. I don't think it is virtue signaling. I think it is just being misled into the action they take. And there are much better organizations to get involved with. And in my opinion, again, I'm not undermining. I have to be a little careful, because like, I'm not undermining civil disobedience. I'm not undermining direct action, because I think that it's needed, actually, like, a lot in this case. But I think you can see the change in rhetoric with certain organizations. Extinction Rebellion is a really good one, because Extinction Rebellion started as Just Stop Oil started. They were essentially just shouting about the issue, disrupting everyone. Everyone was really pissed off with them. They got relative support, but like from quite a niche group of society. But pretty much everyone else was just like, I'd rather like actually work on solutions than just shout about problems. But they've changed. They've changed their rhetoric, and now they've actually like turned their back on disrupting day-to-day life. They organize protests which are like pre-planned and pre-organized. Like, everyone knows they're happening. They take petitions and they put pressure on government officials. Like, so they've almost taken a leaf out of Greenpeace's book now, where they're going, okay, actually the best way to get a solution is to like present solutions and like try and get those put through government and put through business. Whereas Just Stop Oil, I think, sort of saw Extinction Rebellion backing off from that direct action and were like, hey, look, like, no one's doing this. Like, why is no one doing this? Well, no one's doing it because
it's always an opportunity to fill that gap, kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think that, again, I just come back to the fact that I think that they have good intentions. The problem is that they're just doing it in a way which like really doesn't really help that much. Like, the only silver lining through any of that is that we're talking about it because of them. But I don't know if that's enough, really, because generally what we're talking about is like having to defend the climate movement rather than actually talking productively about solutions.
It's putting it on the back foot. So I would say that isn't enough at all. I agree. Because it's changing the conversation entirely to what is an appropriate way of dealing with these issues, as opposed to the issue itself. Like, we're not really even talking of the oil problem itself whenever the conversation comes up. It's not like, well, actually, I don't really agree with what they do. But on the topic of that, it's always just, this is how it goes, right?
I do think,
but what you mentioned about
I do think there's a piece there, though, that like the media has a responsibility to like take context and use context before reporting, and actually they don't do that. They take like the immediate reactionary reporting because it's like more sensationalist, and then that gets them more viewers, and then blah 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 blah. It causes more like disruption and like and people complain and like, woo, we've got good viewer numbers, and like actually that's a problem because the independent media was set up so that when these things happen, the question is, why are you doing this? Not, you're a bad person for doing this. So that whole conversation
but to play devil's advocate there, I mean, like, that is basically the same sort of comparison that I made earlier of like, trying to tell off one kid and the kid saying, well, go and look at what they're doing. Because it's like, we know the media has its problems, but that isn't the point. Like, they knew, Just Stop Oil knew the media had its problems. They knew full well how they were going to be portrayed in the media. If they didn't, then they were stupid. And if they didn't then, they do know now that every time they do something, how they're going to be portrayed in the media. And the fact is, I'll be honest, I don't think the media is doing necessarily a particularly bad job when it comes to reporting on that, because they are reporting the actual impact it's having on people, which is generally negative. So, I mean, that is reporting the news. That is saying the challenge is they're gluing themselves to the road and preventing traffic.
The challenge is, though, Greg, is that, yes, like if they left it there, then sure, like they could talk about the action that Just Stop Oil has taken and rightfully question it and talk about that as a media story in its own right without talking about all of the stuff and preamble around it. The challenge is that they don't stop there. Then they go, well, you know, like, then they go into the rhetoric of like, well, the climate movement, like, why are you even questioning it? Like, you're wearing clothes, aren't you? Like, how can you stand there and tell us not to? Like, and that's just not helpful, because, and that's bad journalism, because you shouldn't be interviewing someone who's there doing something which you may or may not agree with, but you should be talking about what they did, not suddenly like, okay, so you are going to ask them why they're doing it, but instead of asking them why they do it because of the actual issue, you're going to ask them why they did it because they're not perfect. Well, that's bad. That's shoddy journalism, like, just on a fundamental.
Yeah. I mean,
so
I
agree
with you. Like I said, I think there are a lot of faults.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of faults with modern media and journalism, for sure.
Yeah.
But again, to play devil's advocate a little bit on that, you also, for your own admission, talking about Just Up Oil, don't really seem to have a very clear message anymore. So I think a lot of what we were seeing about, when reporters are doing this sort of, probing and saying and pointing out the hypocrisy of an individual, which is fair. Like we said in the early, beginning part of this conversation, question everything, nothing wrong with that. Media are entitled to do that too. But the reason why I think they did that is because they would stop a lot of these protesters and say, right, tell us what it is that your goals are. What is it that you want? So we can stop this madness. And the answers weren't satisfactory. So, I mean, like, when you put a reporter or, a media organization or the public in that position, well, then it's going to be open season on that individual or group of people to be like, well, then you're hypocrites. You're doing this, you're sitting in the middle of the road, you're being disruptive, and you don't have a particularly good reason or set of solutions as to why. Well, then I'm sorry, but you're fair game. And I kind of understand that. I'm not saying I support it, but I understand it. You are kind of opening yourself up either as an individual or as an organization for that sort of scrutiny, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, but that's the media's job. But as well as reporting the news, they're also a content organization, and they need to be consumed. And we know that comes with a whole lot of faults in itself, right? Or as an organization for that sort of scrutiny, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, but that's the media's job. But as well as reporting the news, they
I agree with the sentiment of being questioned. I don't think we'll find agreement though on like some of the tactics used in that, but that's fine. Like, everyone has.
Yeah, well, no, and look, I don't agree with them necessarily either, but I understand why it happened.
Yeah, and I do. Yeah, and I also just, like, as a sort of like follow on, like, as much as I might not agree, again, I just come back to the fact that, like, I think these people have really good intentions. They are basing everything off of climate science. Like, they're not just like pulling shit out of thin air and disrupting people's lives. Because there is a very, very serious issue, as we were talking about earlier. Their tactics are wrong, but in my opinion, but that, I can't vilify them for that, because it's frustrating, it's damaging. But the question I always come back to is, like, it is frustrating to be disrupted. It is challenging. It's probably not the right tactic to have productive conversation, and they're certainly not producing lots of solutions to that conversation. But also, on the flip side of all of that, if we did nothing, and I know you're not saying that at all, but a lot of the conversation is like, you guys should just like bugger off and like not be here. And like, if they did absolutely nothing, regardless of whether we agree with the tactics, I can guarantee that, like, a city on fire or a drought where people can't drink water for weeks on end is going to be much more disruptive to their lives than a bunch of people who have really good intentions but just like are slightly misled in how they do it. So I think, like, I agree, question what they're doing, make them think about it, but vilifying them isn't the right thing to do, like, from the media's perspective or anyone's perspective, because they're doing it for a good reason. They're just doing it wrongly. And I suppose I would say to that no one's vilifying them other than themselves, I think, personally. But that's neither here nor there, I suppose. That's what. But no, it's super interesting. But do you think that then, obviously you work with Greenpeace and you advise the government on certain issues and so on, like, it seems to me like you're of a similar opinion to me, in the sense that I think diplomacy has a lot to do with how
we can move the needle somewhat. Yes, we focus about enterprise, I think, being the main driving force of ultimately solving the bigger solution. But diplomacy is important too. These conversations need to happen. Whether your advice gets ignored or not is kind of a whole different thing, which in itself, I imagine, is extraordinarily frustrating. But that's important. Do you think that these organizations like Greenpeace, like Extinction Rebellion, like Just Stop Oil, and the many others should be sitting down more and coordinating a little bit more and actually having some conversations themselves? Because ultimately, like I said, the actions of these organizations separately affect one another. Right, they affect the public perception and therefore government perception of the issues at hand. Is there that coordination? Should there be that coordination, do you think?
Super interesting. Yeah, I think it's challenging, isn't it? Because, for example, Greenpeace has been running for 50 years and has not been using those tactics generally. Like, they might have made mistakes in the past and then admitted them, but generally it's been like target businesses, target governments, speak to governments around the board table, and speak to businesses around the board table. But I think like the challenge for them is that they can't adamantly say we don't support it, because then they're sort of saying we don't support their reasons for doing it. And I know that's not what they're saying, but that's how people would read it. And they've always got to think about PR angle, right? So they can't openly say we don't agree with the actions they're taking. Similarly, though, they're obviously damaged by that. As I say, Greenpeace got chucked into the same bag as these organizations for years, and it's like, well, not really. We do something a bit different, but I guess like part of the same movement. And so the challenge, if you don't then say something out, then you get sort of tied in with them. But the other problem is that if you then go and speak to those organizations, then you are definitely associated with them, because then you are absolutely working with them. And actually, Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion have done stuff together, but only in stuff which isn't targeting individuals. And now that Extinction Rebellion has changed its tone sort of entirely, I expect you'll see more collaboration between the two organizations just like going forward. As with like Friends of the Earth as well, like they're a great example as well. Amnesty International, like these organizations are all doing sort of the same work, but like now they'll probably collaborate more because they're all using the same tactics. Just Stop Oil is slightly like more fringe, because then they're like, well, Extinction Rebellion's moved away from those tactics. Greenpeace has never used those tactics. Definitely not Friends of the Earth and Amnesty. So it's like, do we talk with them and try and get them to join the sort of like positive movement that we've been having? Or do we just like disassociate and go, we're not going to say anything, let them do their thing? Even if that reflects a little bit negatively on us and we get associated slightly, it's better than us collaborating with them. I don't know if that's the conversation or the rhetoric that's happening. I can't speak on behalf of these organizations. I don't work in them anymore. I've worked with them still, but I'm not an employee. But I think that it's probably probably inside their comms department, like pretty heated conversation about what stance they should take. And I know that in the past as well, we've been briefed on what we should say about Extinction Rebellion actions that had been taken place that weekend. And it's like, that wasn't Greenpeace. Greenpeace isn't associated with any other organization. We are completely independent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, because purely from the fact that if we do associate with anyone, if they do anything wrong, we get the backlash. So I think that's probably where they're sitting, is just like, they'll collaborate so long as the tactics used are like within remit of like what they deem acceptable. But I think they won't sort of call out the others, because the challenge is that then they disenfranchise some of the climate movement as well, because there are lots of people who support Just Stop Oil. So like, Greenpeace needs those people. Greenpeace needs those people to support Greenpeace as well, and support Friends of the Earth and support Amnesty International and all of these other organizations. So they're a little bit between a rock and a hard place, I think. I would like more coverage on the less exciting stuff that these organizations do, but that's a
and me too, because if like you said, there's a lot of stuff happening in boardrooms, and we're not privy to that, and or if we are, I'm sure the information is there, but you would have to be within those channels in order to receive that. It's not mainstream, which is kind of going back always to the main point of all of this, which is the reason why Canopy exists, and the reason why all of these businesses that I believe will succeed is because you're making things convenient for people aren't actively going out and seeking this information. You need to give it to them, and this is a broader problem, because of Greenpeace is doing some amazing work and has done for a number of years, like you said, they made mistakes, but who hasn't, right?
Yeah, of course, right.
And yeah, exactly. And yeah, I agree. I think we should be hearing more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
I
definitely
don't know what the solution is to that, other than maybe, you know, more money for the PR department at Greenpeace, right?
This is the challenge as well, right? Like, so Greenpeace isn't a charity, so they get no like business or governmental sort of support through charitable donations or gift aid or anything like that. They are 100% independently funded by individuals who give money. So therefore they have no sort of association with anyone, and it means that they can sort of call out anyone as well, whereas other organizations like WWF, for example, are a charity and they take money from big organizations, and then they're sort of like tied a little bit in what they can and can't do, because then they lose their money, they lose their funding. So what you see is Greenpeace being this great organization with like brilliant campaigns, but just like really limited funding. And it does make it hard, because then you've got great teams working really hard, paid okay, but like definitely like not enough for the work that they're doing. You know, when you look at the one thing that always used to come up with when I spoke with people when I used to fundraise for Greenpeace was like, oh yeah, but the execs of these organizations are paid like ridiculous amounts of money. Where's my money going to go? Greenpeace was always really open. Like, yeah, our exec is paid like £70,000. He lives in the center of London because he's working consistently on diplomatic campaigns. And it's definitely not enough for the work that he does. And that's the highest.
£70,000 is not a lot of money for.
That's the highest salary in the entire of Greenpeace, right? Like, and I think that compare that to some other charities where their organization, well, Greenpeace isn't a charity, but compare it to charities where they've got business money, government money, and then they're spending money on their salaries of like 400, 500, 600,000 pounds, sometimes over £1 million, depending on who they are. And it's like, that's not justified, in my opinion. And that's the people you should be challenging. But also, I just come back to the point that generally, like with all of these movements, I think what we should focus more on is like, what are they talking about? And like, why are they there? Why do they exist? They wouldn't exist if they didn't have something to talk about. So like, really, we should just like remove all the fluff ultimately. And we should just like go right back to the root cause, which is like, what's the problem? What are their supposed solutions? And what are the barriers for people adopting these solutions? And then can business fill the gap and help basically cross that barrier? And I think that would be a good collaboration to start seeing more of, is just like seeing those. This is why Canopy exists, right? Like seeing those barriers for our entire careers of speaking to people both within and without these organizations, and then going, okay, there are these things which those organizations are never going to be able to facilitate because they're NGOs or charities, they're not businesses. So we can do that as a business. We can facilitate that, and we can drive that in the current economy that we have. So that's really all about it for us.
Yeah. And look, we've got the opportunity right now to a degree. We've got an audience, we've got a platform right now. What are some things that you are aware of Greenpeace have either done in your time working with them or are working on actively now, or maybe some other organizations that you want to highlight now, to the listeners, to the watchers, because of, you know, like we just said, that's part of the problem, is there isn't enough being heard about that. So what are these things happening in the boardrooms? What are the things that they're pushing, and the solutions that they've managed to it? What have they achieved? What are they achieving?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, we could go through the entire history of Greenpeace.
Oh yeah, let's not go through the entire list, but you know, maybe some things notable that you think people should hear about.
Yeah, so I think
that, you know, isn't being talked about, because I think that would be really interesting for people.
I think some of the interesting stuff is like around, you know, we're all aware that microplastics, plastic microbeads are being banned in the UK. This came after Greenpeace action. We've seen Shell and other big oil companies drop plans for like Arctic drilling for oil and gas. That's because of Greenpeace campaigns, and Friends of the Earth as well, like getting involved in these great campaigns, which they both speak to these companies, but also put pressure on these companies like externally. One of the most recent ones was sort of like a really historic global ocean treaty to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030. These sort of things, I've worked on those campaigns, and generally it's like quite a long slog. And, you know, to have tens and tens of countries signing up globally to support these treaties is a huge win. I think one of the examples I always use, which I really enjoy talking about, is that going actually back to the palm oil question that I was mentioning earlier. Greenpeace found out through investigative research that Santander was investing it's the people who bank with them, their money into unsustainable palm oil, into a company which purely did this slash and burn technique in Indonesia and beyond. And we went to Santander and we said, look, we've exposed this. Here's a strategy in which you can shift that to palm oil, which is certified to not be on new land, but only on previous plantations. So you're not damaging more biodiversity. You're just you're not losing investment money because you're still investing into this now new industry, but it's better than it was. And here's a transitionary plan. And they said, no, we're not interested. We're not going to talk to you. So Greenpeace launched a campaign letting basically, and you may have seen it, the orangutan campaign. One of their ads was banned. Like they went around on streets in orangutan costumes and like did lots of stuff outside Santander HQ. In 72 hours of running the campaign, hundreds of thousands of people had started to sort of remove their bank accounts from Santander and moving over to other banks. So Santander got back in touch with Greenpeace and said, we'd like to talk. And then we managed to make them change their entire palm oil investment strategy into a sustainable palm oil strategy investment strategy. And I think that that's just like, that's a very short time frame. Like, don't get me wrong, like that's very rare that happens so quickly. But it's the sort of power that individuals can have through organizations like Greenpeace, like Friends of the Earth, like Amnesty International, and obviously if it's not to do with the environment, other organizations as well, like Save the Children or Human Rights Watch or whatever it is. Like you can support these organizations and they're doing the heavy lifting, they're doing the work. You don't need to do anything. You just need to be a member. You need to have anywhere between 3 and then as much as the limit is for you, pounds a month to support them. And it's like, you can basically then not sit back, you still need to be taking individual action, but you can know that those wins that are happening because you've put your name behind them. So I think that those are some of the wins and some of the things that we can start to witness more and be a part of as a society. But also I think that as individuals, like use your voice, like use your wallet. You don't have to change your life radically. You can just support businesses which are doing better. You can support organizations which are pushing for change without even you needing to do anything else in your life. So I think that there's some real power just generally in our lifestyles that we have, which we generally don't talk about. And we could use that for positive change.
And money and time talks. But I really love that example you gave there with that Santander palm oil example, because what stands out to me the most about that is that Greenpeace weren't going to Santander and just saying you are bad because of what you're doing and you should change it, but actually coming with a solution, a plan, everything. Like you just saying we've taken the time to do this, and there was no reason they had to do that. They didn't have to. You could very easily have just said you should change this, but of course, like we're talking about very large organizations with a lot of stakeholders. As much as there may be a couple of people that agree with that on their board, that isn't enough. And there needs to be a financial reason, at the end of the day, to make it happen. One that does save them time, does save them money, and all that. So that's a great example to me, because of it is, as much as it would be easy to like I don't know, you just go up to anyone and just point the finger, and say you should do better. Like you were saying about Just Oil, pointing at people in cars and saying, what are you doing? It's like, okay, well, give me an alternative. Like, and I think that's where it has the biggest impact, so that's a really great example of that.
Solutions always, like, if you can't talk about a solution at the end of complaining about a problem, then like,
well, you're just moaning.
Just go and support an organization. And look, not everybody needs to be a founder. Not everybody needs to like go and start an initiative. Like there are lots of things you can go and support. So if you can go and support them, go and do your action and shout about the problems, but then be like, oh, and also we support this organization or we support this thing that's happening. And then that gives actionable changes that people can make without having to feel like we're consistently just being told we're bad.
Right, and have a bit of put a bit of time into understanding what the possible solutions are, so that when you are confronted with it, as someone who's maybe talking about it, you can rattle them off and say, I actually have looked at this. I've taken the time. There are other ways of doing this thing. Like, going back to what I was saying earlier about this post that I've got coming up, talking about a recent guest. One of the things I mentioned in that is about how I think, because it all started as well, it's tied into with an event I went to not too long ago about tech for good. That you may have seen me post about recently, which was largely a good event. It was a keynote speaker there from Shifted, speaking about tech for good globally and the sort of issues with VC money and they're not backing the right things. No. And it was largely a good thing, but there was one thing missing. At the end, they did a panel and someone asked, what can people do? And at no point did anyone on the panel say something which I think is really obvious, which is just support these founders, support these startups. When there are betas, sign up. When you're asked to be an early adopter of something, do it. And that was really surprising that no one was talking about that in a forum full of founders. Like, to me, that seems like the obvious thing. When there are crowd funds, launched on Kickstarter, contribute, pledge, become an angel investor. There are people out there with money that wants to do some good with it, become an angel investor, and like you said, create a thesis that is targeted towards these sort of businesses. There's a lot people can do in this space, which I think really moves the needle in being able to get founders like yourself funded and moving forward. Or at the very, very least, if you don't have the money, give them your time, beta test a product. Sometimes it's just 10 minutes of your day to do something, use it and give feedback, fill out a survey. Like, these are really, really impactful things, in my opinion, and being able to make a significant change. If you don't want to go out on the street and glue your hands to the floor, like, do you know what I mean? Which most people don't want to do. So
I definitely agree. I think like bringing support in whatever way is reasonable for you as an individual to organizations that need it, that are changing, like doing good, is absolutely fundamentally needed just in society, and more talk should be around that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's my sort of call to action that I've been harping on for a little while about. I mean, not just because I'm slightly biased, because as a founder, I want people to to be early adopters of my product, as do you and as do all the founders. But like, I honestly believe that for these sustainable startups and those startups really wanting to affect change, some of them are pretty ambitious too. Like, you need as much support as possible. So that's the box that I will stand on, as it were. But no, it's super interesting. So talk me through then, like, just to go back to Canopy more a little bit, because I did warn you we're going to talk about all kinds of crazy shit. But let's take it back to Canopy right now. So what's the next step? What's going to happen next? So you've got a lot that's just happened, like you touched on. What's the future looking like? The rest of this year into Q1 of next year, you must have a lot planned, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think, like, for us, we love moving fast and growing fast, and we're not the type of company which is just interested in sort of like sitting back and riding the wave. We want to like create the wave. So now that we've public launched the platform and we've sort of seen a huge uptick in the number of people signing up and using it and buying stuff, ultimately is really a big push on that growth and making sure that those metrics make sense from a commercial perspective. So all about retention and sort of like all about the stickiness of the platform, and also, of course, like how much we're spending to acquire those people. But essentially for us, we now, to like this week, turn on our digital, but within that, actually, we have like 3 different pillars of strategy to grow as a company, which is across digital, PR and guerrilla marketing, and then big brand partnerships. So you'll see all of these things being implemented over the next sort of few months and for the lifetime of the company, of course. Some great organizations that we're looking to do work with over the next few months are, City to Sea, a great charity doing plastic action, Stuffers Against Sewage, Water Aid, some really great organizations that we can't wait to do campaigns with. And the reason for tying our work in with their work is that it gives the people who support those charities actionable things they can then go and do in their lives to make an impact on that campaign, like buying less, plastic, or buying less where it is. Like Canopy can sort of like facilitate that. And then on the flip side, our users don't feel like they're just supporting a business, but they're actually supporting maybe a charity doing good as well through their contribution and financial support to the company. Really, all of this, of course, is like the super busiest time for like a consumer company. Christmas is coming up, like obviously Black Friday is coming up. We've got some really fun campaigns around sort of greenwashing and like why you need to be careful of green claims and like how Canopy can help with that and all of this great like positive stuff around that. So look out for those. Christmas is going to be fun, but then really the big goal for us is that we're going out to raise a 1.5 million seed round in Q1. And then that will really allow us to sort of diversify our revenue streams, expand our sort of customer acquisition in the UK, and then start eyeing up our next geography as well as a company to launch the platform in, which is likely to be sort of the Nordics or somewhere in Western Europe, but we're still doing all of that research. But yeah, so it's a very, very busy, very exciting time. We've got Techstars, so we're on Techstars at the minute, which is really great. It's a super brilliant program. They're a great investor to have on the cap table. But obviously, with that program coming to the end at the beginning of December, really for us at that point, it's like everything is like focused on like using that network we've created in that ecosystem to then really facilitate the growth of, you know, better buying in a mainstream market.
Yeah, so a lot of spinning plates, which is to be expected, but very exciting time. With you know, just talk to me about the sort of fundamentals of the platform. So I'm curious, but we're in terms of how it works in relation to suppliers. So is this something that suppliers can just go to the platform and sort of register and submit essentially their application to be featured on the platform, or are you, or is it a bit of that, and then of course you reaching out to maybe suppliers that you've researched, you know, products that you've researched that are innovative in this space, and you asking them to join? Is it kind of a mixture of these two things?
Yeah, so obviously naturally with any business there's outbound, like we need to increase supply consistently, and we have like a huge research list of brands that we think would be appropriate to get through our verification process. Interestingly, not all of them do, which is like super like eye-opening just to see what sort of is on the market and what's being said on the market.
Yeah, interesting.
Because obviously you've got to take, you can't take everything at face value, so that's why Canopy exists, to verify that for people. So I guess
that goes to what you were saying about, you know, being aware of greenwashing as a consumer and so on. It kind of ties into that. So you must have a fair amount of data on that to pull from. Yeah.
Well, exactly. It's more for us about like if they're making green claims that they've got the evidence to back them up, which makes us the only marketplace which is compliant with that regulation I mentioned earlier, the Green Claims Code, and you know, coming out of the UK government actually on claims that companies can make, and you know, that makes us not only future-proof, but also gives a huge amount of trust to consumers and vendors, because they won't be selling against something which is basically lying about their green claims, because it would have had to have been verified by Canopy. So the steps for a brand are essentially, whether they come from an outbound or an inbound, they have to go through the vetting of their claims. And that's quite a streamlined process, to be honest. Like they have to go through their business, their product, and the materials of their product, and just submit that into our platform. And then we can, obviously at the same time, uploading evidence next to each claim they make. And then that just gets verified on our backend system within the parameters that we've set of what we accept as evidence. If for the ones that are approved, like then we bring those products through onto the platform in a classic marketplace model. But within that, there's loads of like tech-enabled education and impact data within the platform itself, so that you as a consumer can not only find like a shop, but also if you have no idea what to swap out, you can actually go and learn like a whole amount in our shop by space feature, which just it's a huge educational platform in itself. But the idea that is there is it means that if you're not really sure, like Canopy's got you, like we've got your back, like here's the information you can find. And then that like obviously all feeds through to making that purchase and beginning your journey as a sustainable shopper. I think fundamentally for us, like the big thing is looking at the things we can tie in from an even more convenient level. So for those refills, for those products that you're buying on a regular basis, like building in subscriptions and bundles and the ability to gift people, and that will allow us to, they're quite standard marketplace and e-commerce things, but it allows us to make sustainable shopping as convenient as sort of not. So really important for us on a product level is the next sort of few months learning what the users are wanting and what they're buying, and then implementing those changes effectively.
Yeah, and from a sort of logistics point of view, how does it work in terms of the suppliers and you? Are you fulfilling the orders? Are you bringing in these products into a centralized warehouse, or are you just sending off these delivery notes to the suppliers and they're fulfilling them? You know, and then how does that affect, you know, maybe the consumer experience in terms of when they can expect the delivery times and things like that?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's probably the one sort of barrier that we have as a startup is that we can't afford to have like entire distribution centers and warehouses and distribution networks. One of the investors in our pre-seed round who used to basically manage Mars, the confectionery company, their like European logistics network. He was like, when I went to him and told him the idea in day one, and the idea was to have that network as well, he was like, don't, like, you're going to need to raise like literally millions like from day one, because otherwise you're just going to burn money and not ever hit profitability. So it's the one thing where we've had to make a conscious choice to sacrifice convenience, actually, which is very rare for us. But basically it means that you can still make all of the orders in one basket. So the actual shopping experience is the same as going on Amazon. The difference is that those products would come individually at this point. And we have made some caveats around that to reduce the impact from an impact perspective, whereby they can't be distributed to you from outside the UK. So they have to be within the UK distribution network already. Then we're not adding new things to that. We're just like inputting things into a network that's already there. But also from a level of the fact that there are time limits on the days that those things can be sent out, so you should receive them quickly. But of course, the vision for us is that we'll get to a point where we've got such a stable growth, or, well, hopefully large growth, but like month on month, that we can justify raising money to implement a logistics, so that then we can hold that stock and get them to you as quickly as you'd want, but in an impactful and sustainable way as well. Generally, though, like that actually. It's really interesting. We did a whole bunch of like customer research, like right at the beginning of the journey, before we even started building, to find out what the priorities were for people. And one of those things that they could choose was like delivery time. And a lot of people put that relatively high, but not super high. And then since we launched and getting feedback from people, everyone's just been like, I don't really mind so long as I can get all the products in one place, and so long as those products actually turn up. I don't really mind if like they all come the same day at the same time. Like as long as I get them in a reasonable amount of time, I'm happy. And that was actually super interesting, because I think we've been led to believe generally as a sector that people just want everything now, like all the time. Like, but actually people are willing to sort of just be like, well, I've made my order. Like, and then so long as they come, like I've got my product. So it's all good. Yeah. And then obviously if we can build in more convenience, great, sure. But like actually it was interesting to see the willingness of that trade-off from people. It makes us feel a little bit better as well, because we were quite nervous that would be a problem.
Yeah, I can imagine. But yeah, it's more about the user experience on the platform ultimately. Absolutely. Rather than the thing. But it's interesting because I spoke with someone recently on this podcast who's a startup founder. Again, it would have been released now before this one, called Lara Solomon, sorry. And she's the founder Hoopsie? Of a. Sorry?
Is that from Hoopsie?
Yes, from Hoopsie. Yeah. Have you spoke with her before?
They're she's one of our vendors.
Oh, really? Fantastic. Yeah. So that's great, because I was going to ask about, presumably a lot of the vendors that you're working with are startups themselves, right? And she was talking about how she's finding it quite difficult to sort of get into people's faces, to get traction on the product, and which is a problem for a lot of people, especially solo founders like herself, who face the problems with, from an economic point of view, and don't have the funds to push things forward. Like, do you see yourselves as being in a quite unique position as Canopy to be able to push some of these products and to help some of these founders actually gain a bit of traction on their products and essentially grow their businesses with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of the things that we're looking to bring in. There's like two things. One is we do a lot of marketing already for the brands. Like obviously we have to, so they're going to see their own products involved in marketing, like for them, but within Canopy. So even though there's a slight payoff there, because obviously we take a commission on sale, it's still growth for them and it's still brand awareness for them. So it's positive. The other thing is that the sort of secondary thing to that is that we have the ability, and we're going to be implementing it, to do sort of help with debt financing for a partner, where they can apply for that through the Canopy platform based on Canopy sales and their sales and other channels, and then get funding to push their own brand more as well. And so we're looking at ways in which we can implement that a partner as well. But that will come. It's not sort of like super high product priority right now, but will be in sort of the new year, probably after that seed round particularly. And then the third thing is that after our seed round, we'll be actually exploring doing sort of like out of home campaigns more, rather than just doing sort of like your digital, your guerrilla marketing, PR, and your partnerships. We'll be looking to sort of do some more traditional marketing, and that actually we have the opportunity to bring brands in on that with us. So we end up covering most of the costs, but then they can basically opt into being part of that campaign and use their products within those campaigns, and then we will make sure that their products are within those ads, so that then we can grow them as well through our marketing even more, reach even more people. So a big thing for us is not just pushing, like, one, not just competing with them on a product level, but also two, not just pushing the marketplace. Like, the whole thing around Canopy is that it's a community of people pushing for the right thing, and therefore we want to all support each other, and if they grow, we grow, and if we grow, they grow. So it's all needs to be with that in mentality, and all of the vendors that we work with have that with us. The other thing, just like from a side note, which is less to do with like marketing and product sales per se, and more to do with just like business management, is that we have built a big sort of like perks and discounts deal flow, essentially, like exclusive to Canopy as partners, whereby what we've said is, like, usually the way that partnerships work is you get like a payback, like a revenue share. Like, so if that company then signs up through your partnership affiliate link, then you get a payout. And we just said, well, forget the payout, make it a discount for the vendors. And it means that we have these really great exclusive deals that vendors can access through Canopy. If you're a Canopy vendor, it means that they then can improve their business, they can, streamline their operations, or whatever it is. And that can be a mix, anything from legal to marketing to impact to certifications. Like, it's all, the idea is to bottle that more and more out as a resource exclusively for Canopy vendors. So lots of stuff that we work to improve their business and help them grow as well, fundamentally. Really, really important for us.
That's great to hear, because like I said, I think it would be foolish not to take advantage of the position that you're in, working with these vendors, right, and be able to support them. Just like we talked about earlier about how, we all have the individual opportunity to support these businesses through the action we take. You have that prime opportunity there. So it's great to see that you've built that into the business model already. So look, I know that you've got to go soon. So why don't would it be useful because I know, when do you have to go? Is it quite imminent?
Well, I technically I have another meeting in 10 minutes, which I need to get to. But I've emailed to say that I'm in a very interesting conversation that I don't want to leave. But I shouldn't leave him hanging too long.
No, that's fine. We can wrap things up. It's fine. You've been very generous with your time already, and I wouldn't want to keep you from a meeting like that. So it's not a problem. So look, let's sort of get to that point then. So this is the only other bit of structure I have in this whole bloody mess of a show, which hopefully you've enjoyed. Which is to ask a bit about. I ask everyone this sort of more towards the end, and it is kind of cliche, but I think it's really useful. Which is, the vast majority of the people listening to this are entrepreneurs or founders themselves, right? Yeah. Or maybe just interested in the particular topic that my guest is going to be talking about, but that is mostly founders. And they're at various stages of their journey. So, you've talked a lot about, how you've got to where you are and what the plans are for the future. But do you have any sort of not so well-known pieces of advice or tips for individuals in the situation of, just starting a business, or, like someone like Laura talked about, who's, really struggling to get traction on the product and so on. Anything really, any little bit of gold that you can share, especially if it's stuff that is maybe things that you feel aren't talked about as much as they should be potentially.
Yeah, it's a tough one, because for people like Lara, for example, I know she's putting a hell of a lot of effort into growing, and it's it can be frustrating as a founder. I know how she feels when you're doing all that effort and you're doing everything you should be doing, and you're struggling to get that traction. But again, like, I think that's just a matter of resilience. Like, you just got to keep pushing, and then it's just one yes that will change that for sort of like the future. So what one piece, guess that first piece of advice is just like, try not to, and I think everyone says this, but and I know how hard it is to actually take on, but like try not to take every no or every barrier as like a personal issue, and just like, you know, accept it and move on, and keep pushing. You know, you're doing something amazing, and you'll get there eventually. You just need to, you know, have that resilience and grit, which is always a bit challenging at certain times. Like I get that. I think the other thing is like there's always a lot of like sus around like talking to people about your idea, depending on how early whoever is listening is, where they are in that journey. But like, no matter what you're doing, honestly, the most valuable thing that we've ever done as startup founders is talk about what we're doing to people, even people who we think could go and do it themselves, because we get really interesting insights, feedback. Most of the time, people are more willing to help you than to take your idea. And to be honest, if you're a startup founder who cares enough about what you're building, like they took the idea and succeeded, it'd be frustrating, but you'd also be really happy, because really what your focus should be like solving the problem. And if someone else solves the problem, then great, right? Like that's a good thing. So I think you know, fundamentally it's a bit of a mental shift, like going from like, oh no, my solution is the only solution, but you basically just want to speak to as many people as possible about what you're doing in a completely open and honest conversation, and get that feedback, and be willing to understand the negatives. Fundamentally, like everyone can tell you how good you are, but actually it's the people who will challenge you who are the most valuable. So it's really, really important. And then I think
essentially how I built my career.
Yeah, just criticize people, and then
I always tell people that when they ask what I do for a living, I say I get ignored for a living.
I think that's just like all of us for a long period of time. And then
right. Yeah, pretty much.
The third thing I'd probably say is like, I think it depends. If you're a solo founder, like this is probably not super relevant to you, like, and apologies, but what I would do is replace the idea of a co-founder with like a good mentor and advisor in this situation. But what I would say is if you have a co-founder or mentor advisor, then I would have a really open and honest conversation about how you feel. I know this sounds really wishy-washy, but it's something that we did internally recently. And it makes a whole world of difference to the motivation of people working within the company, is if they feel listened to and not just like consistently feeling the pressure to work. And as much as like everything needs to be fast paced, we've got a million and one things to do. At the same time, the most valuable resource in your startup is you as a person. It doesn't matter what your product is, doesn't matter how much money you've got, how much equity you've got, blah, 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 blah. The most valuable person that has founded the company is the founder. So you don't want to be in a situation where you become bitter or resentful to that, or any of your co-founders feel that way. So we've definitely been at points through various journeys, whether in this company or previous companies, where we felt like frustrated or like bitterness towards what we're doing, and we don't want that. So the best thing I can ever give from an advisory perspective on that end is to very early on and consistently build in time to listen and talk about how you feel, and like what's pressuring you, and whether there's any way to navigate that or mitigate that, whether it's something you just have to deal with, and then people can support you through that. But yeah, being really open emotionally is an extremely valuable resource as a founder, and not enough people do it, particularly with their co-founders, which I find we found extremely valuable to do.
That's some really good advice, and one that I believe that I hopefully contribute to in some sort of positive way, because I've noticed that, you know, with my founders that I work with as a commercial advisor, over the years I've shifted the sort of way I describe what I do as just strictly commercial advisor to commercial advisor and coach, because actually, you know, some of the time, you know, I sort of joke about this, but a lot of the time it ends up being, you know, I'm part therapist in a lot of the time that I work with individuals, because it is actually so important from my perspective to get the emotional what's the word like you used, motivations behind things, or how someone's feeling at the time, and you know, because that's such an important part of it. And you know, it can be as simple as just noticing that someone's slightly off in a session and just being like, right, let's put aside what it was we're going to talk about, let's address this. How are you? Like, what do you need? Like, what's going on? Because, you know, as is quite often said again and again, being a founder can be quite a lonely road. We know that it's almost somewhat cliche at this point, but it's very true. And, you know, it's not always appropriate for that founder to share how they're feeling with their co-workers. Like, that can undermine sometimes, you know, how they're perceived, and their, you know, their level of resilience and all that sort of stuff. So having a third party ideally bundled into one that's also going to give you some strategic advice too, and how to balance that strategy with your capacity emotionally to be able to deal with these things, I find, I hope, is a valuable resource to them. And I would encourage anyone out there who's an advisor to try and adopt more of that, or a mentor to adopt more of that mentality, because, you know, not just think, well, this isn't my job, like, but to actually, you know, consider the human impact that can have, because I think it's far more constructive. Yeah. 100%. So yeah, great advice. I appreciate it, man. That's really cool. And and again, I really appreciate your time with us today. I'll let you go, so you've got a couple of minutes to prepare. I'm sure you're probably dying to go to the loo and grab a coffee or something before your next meeting. So I'll allow you to do that. But yeah, I mean, look, is there anything, while we've got like a couple of minutes, is there anything you wanted to get off your chest that I didn't ask you about, didn't have the opportunity to talk about when it comes to you, Canopy, any of the subjects we've covered, or maybe anything you wanted to ask me? I've never asked that before.
I think fundamentally, like, all I'd say is that this is a super exciting time for the industry, but it's also a super challenging time for everyone, just economically. And I would just come back to that one point, that you don't need to be a perfect consumer. You can buy better, and Canopy is here to build convenience into that better shopping journey. So please do come and, you know, check out the platform. Even if you don't buy anything, I'd love to hear from you and get feedback from that. It's the only way that startups can improve. So basically just an encouragement of come and try us out and see what you think, and any feedback goes a long way. So that I'd say, and it's canopy.com, so it should be relatively easy to find.
Yeah, and I'll put the link to that in the description, as well as your profile on LinkedIn. And look, if there's any other links that you want to send me that you think I should include in there, to anything else at all, feel free. I will always welcome that from my guests. But yeah, that will be in there at the very, very least as well. So listen, man, all that's left to do is say, again, thank you for the generosity of your time, but also the generosity of your thoughts and opinions. Like, you know, I really appreciate it. You know, I asked some questions there to sort of challenge you a little bit, but I think it's important. And this is why I do what I do, because I think it's important for there to be actual discussions on things, as opposed to shutting each other down. And so hopefully this allowed you the opportunity to talk about things that are important. Look, man,
you
all the success.
For having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I appreciate it. And have a good one, and a great rest of the week, and we'll speak again soon.
You too, dude. Cheers, Greg. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you for listening and/or watching. Please like and subscribe and join in the conversation in the comments below.